Well, good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll probably start with we got a few hours here, so it'd be good to get started. So I just want to start by welcoming you all today to participate in the elected officials workshop for the climate action strategy. And as always, we just wanted to begin by acknowledging that we're gathering today on the unceded traditional territory of the Comox First Nation, the traditional keepers of this land. My name is Will Cole-Hamilton. I'm a councillor in the city of Courtenay and the chair of the Comox Valley Regional District. And for RRD, the climate crisis and environmental stewardship and protection is one of the strategic drivers that we've selected to act upon. One of the key steps in responding to this board priority is the development of a climate action strategy to improve climate change resiliency in the region. And we began this journey together in this room back in January with the first Climate Elected Officials Forum. In the time since, staff have met with elected officials, local government officials, community groups, and local youth. And from these meetings, the CVRD has identified possible actions to reduce regional GHG emissions and increase resilience to adapt to the impacts of climate change, including key cross-cutting critical actions that will be presented later today. Through the workshops and the development of these critical actions, staff have identified the need to integrate climate risk more broadly across CVRD services and the organization. So to support this effort, today's workshop is presented as a learning opportunity. It's a chance to hear from experts in the field, to ask the questions that you have in mind, and gain context in advance of the presentation of the draft climate action strategy. I want to welcome here our presenters for joining us in person and virtually, and thank all of you for being here. There's great value in gathering together and sharing our thoughts, particularly when we can in person. And I know that 4.5 hours was a lot to extract from many of your busy schedules. So I really do appreciate the significant amount of time you're devoting to this. And I may be sort of courting disaster by asking elected officials to briefly introduce themselves. This could take a while, but I'm really hoping that we can do this in a reasonable amount of time. And I just wanted to take a particular note to say how pleased I am to see Carl and Candace from the Comox First Nation. It's your first elected officials forum, so welcome both of you, and thanks for making time. So maybe we'll go clockwise from me. So perhaps Mayor Wells.
Mayor Bob Wells from the city of Courtenay.
Jonathan Kerr, councillor, town of Comox.
Edwin Grieve, director for Area C at Comox Valley Regional District.
Councillor with the Ben Gesselbrock, councillor with the city of Nanaimo, and board member on the regional district in Nanaimo.
Allison Ashcroft, Director of Sustainability with the Municipal Finance Authority of British Columbia.
Daniel Haig with Stantec Consulting.
Liz Newman, elected councillor for Comox First Nation.
Coral McKay, elected councillor, Comox First Nation.
My name is Shannon Aldinger. I'm a school trustee for the city of Courtenay with the Board of Education for Comox Valley Schools.
Ken Grant, town of Comox.
Thank you.
Jen Mayer, town of Comox.
Troy Tarian, councillor, Cumberland.
Wendy Morin, Courtenay councillor and on the board of the RD. Thanks.
Vicki Brown, Mayor, Cumberland.
Nick Ward, councillor-elect, Village of Cumberland.
Nicole Minions, Mayor, town of Comox.
Doug Hillian, city of Courtenay and regional district director.
Great, and thank you everyone again for making the time to be here. And I'm going to pass this over at this point to Robin Ward to get things started.
Thank you, Chair.
My name is Robin Home, and I'm the Manager of Long Range Planning and Sustainability here at the CVRD. Thank you all for joining us this afternoon for this forum, and thank you for participating in our initial sticky note activity to ground our work today and recognizing that climate change is a complex topic that also has personal impacts for all of us here and for the community and lands we call home. I'm very excited to welcome our first speaker today, Mayor Mike Getz from the City of Merritt, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, who is joining us virtually. He was first elected as councillor for the City of Merritt in 2009, and in 2022, after Merritt experienced a disastrous triple atmospheric river event in 2021 that led to the widespread flooding and full community evacuation, he was elected as mayor. During his time in office, Mayor Getz has been focused on fire and flood mitigation work and on advocating for improved support from higher levels of government for local governments on front lines of climate emergencies. And with that, I will turn it over to Mayor Getz.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Give me the thumbs up if you can, or just start waving if you can't. Thank you very much for being here. I did meet with the staff before that. And first of all, I'd like to let you know that I'm attending from the traditional territories of the Inca Kappa Silk people and unceded, and talked with the staff, and we talked about some areas that one of the things about a flood is, and any kind of reclamation, whether it be flood or fire, it becomes very large very quickly. And there are so many different avenues that you can go down. So we decided that we would discuss things that probably would be some of the first things that you would notice. The climate change risk area, if we want to talk about that, how did that change Merritt? So before 2022 or 2021, when we had the flood, we had a floodplain of 130 people that were in the first area of floodplain. After the flood, we now have 1,275 people that are now considered in the floodplain. A massive jump in that issue, and what changes there is the ability for people to rebuild, or when they build in these areas, how this changes how homes can be built, and how we move forward in that situation. Every home now has to be built 1 meter plus 6 higher than it normally is. Every trailer or mobile home that is in that area has to be, again, 1 meter plus 6 high, and it has to be on a cement pad, and it has to be attached and locked down to the cement pad. Things have drastically changed. Most of our mobile home parks that have been rebuilt are on a thing called screw piles. And gives the ability for the person who owns the home to actually jack their house up. And it's been very successful, and it works very well. How can a local government, prep to reduce climate change impacts? One of the first lessons that we learned right after the impact was the fact that we needed to have a recovery operations center. That is a group of people that are on your staff that now focus solely on bringing your community back from the flood situation, because as the waters recede, a lot of things change, or the fire has gone through, a lot of things change. And you do need a point of contact, because that point of contact becomes the most important thing that you have as you move forward. You will immediately have input from the provincial government, usually from MCSE. They will be on board with you in your EOC room, and there will be a lot of things happening at that point in time. Your ROC will be the people that now connect with federal and provincial groups trying to get funding. One of the things that we had here 2 days after the flood is we were one of the only communities that have been completely evacuated. We had to evacuate 7,500 people at 3:30 in the morning. And when we came back, a quarter of our community was completely underwater. And when the waters receded, what ended up happening is a lot of that mud and soil and everything went into the sewer, went into the drains. And for about 14 days, for 24 hours a day, we had vacuum trucks running all day long, trying to clean the drains out and all the rest of that kind of stuff. And that's where your ability of your ROC to work with federal and provincial government for funding to help pay for some of these items that are in your community are very important. I was flooded. I was out of my home for about 4 weeks. My family was out of it for about 3 months. It took me 12 months to recover my home. And it was an experience that, you once you've gone through it, it's something you really don't want to to continue on. One of the things that has come out of this is that I've been very adamant with the provincial government on a provincial diking strategy. Right now, all diking is left to rural communities, the TNRD or the regional districts and the communities. They expect us to look after our dikes, inspect them, and make sure that they're in great shape. The only problem is we don't have the ability to do that. We don't have hired agrologists that can walk these dikes and say, hey, you know, we've got a problem here. What normally we do here is we send out our director of public works along with somebody from the forestry, walk the dikes and have a look at it. And it just doesn't really, they don't know what they're really looking at. We also have a term called orphan dikes, and those are dikes that are owned by no one and they're never inspected. Now, one of the issues that happened with Merit in 2020 and 2021, they decided to bypass the diking inspections, and there was a bit of an issue over that. But I have to tell you, with the amount of water that came through here now, with the Coldwater River, we get normally excited at about 152 meters per second coming through. That gets us pretty high. When we had the height of the flood, we were 358 meters per second. And the only reason it stopped there is because the monitor actually got washed away at 426 cubic meters. So even if we would have had dikes that were properly inspected and even at Q200 levels, we would have seen a severe amount of flooding no matter what happened. This was kind of a 1 in 1,000 year situation that we had here. So, but it's still very important for these dikes to be inspected and looked after. And the problem is when you go to rebuild a dike like we are right now, you end up with a lot of provincial and federal government intervention. They want to be involved with it. They want to inspect the dikes, but they actually do not want to own the dikes, but they want to be able to control how you build these dikes. And it starts to get a little bit in the way. So and I'm hoping other communities will start asking the provincial government to have a provincial diking strategy, fund it correctly, and inspect the dikes correctly, because it's imperative that communities have that. Without that, you know, you can run into issues with dikes that have been long forgotten and then they fail, and then you're in a problem. We talk about, since the flood, we've also talked a lot about fire mitigation in our community, because we have a lot of wildfires around us. In 2001, we were on standby to be evacuated because we had the Juliet Creek fire right at our door. Lucky for us, the weather changed. So what have we done in the meantime on that? So the community got together. We decided that we would try something a little different. So we started bringing in goats that roam our community and bring down the brush. And they're up in the hills and everything, and they do a really, really good job. And this coming year, we'll probably be using cows as well. Because the cows can handle bigger items, and the goats don't like to climb hills, but cows apparently do. So they do a very, very good job. And one of the things that we found out with the fire mitigation is that if you can get the fuel off the floor, you are standing a really good chance of stopping a fire as it moves along. We're also looking now at working with First Nations and retired professional foresters that have been hired by groups such as some of the First Nations groups around here to look after the forests on lands and traditional lands. And they have started doing spacing and all of this kind of stuff, very innovative stuff. The bands took us out earlier this spring, and we walked through several areas that have had the prescriptions done on them. And we could see where an actual large fire had stopped in its tracks because of the mitigation work that was going on. And one of the things that I sat on last year a little bit was the Premier's expert panel on wildfire. And I think it's extremely important that we have the knowledge of First Nations involved as we work forward on these forests. They've tilled this land for many, many millennia, and they know how things work. So that's knowledge that comes into play, and it's being used here, and I'm thankful that we have it. The other thing that we started looking at with the forests as well is with the thinning. I don't know if you saw West Kelowna. When West Kelowna was on fire, you'll notice that a lot of the houses were burning, but there was no trees even remotely close to them. And that's the reason, because the forest floor, or the floor, was so full of combustible material that it moved towards the houses and took the houses out. One of the issues that we do run into this with our local firefighters that are doing the mitigation work is we end up coming to the boundaries of Crown land. And by law, we're not allowed to move onto Crown land to do fire mitigation. And that's where it stops. So we have been making application with the government, seeing if they will allow us to continue our mitigation into Crown land to protect more and more of the forest. And we're making some headway on that. I can't say that we're there yet, but it only makes common sense for us to be able to move in that direction. And that will protect our communities a lot more. Because there's, it's not just floods, it's also fires. We basically have 2 seasons of things that can go wrong. The other thing that we talked about was the value of emergency management. So emergency management now with climate change is a very real thing. And for a number of years, we had one of our fire department people working off the side of their desk running emergency management. And it got a little cumbersome and they were unable to kind of continue to do it. So we took the first steps to hire a full-time emergency management coordinator. And he came on board with us this spring. So his job is to wake up every day like the world is falling apart, like we're on our last legs and everything's going wrong. And his job is we set up a permanent EOC that is fully ready to go with a generator. It's in the safest place in our community. It has its own internet. And it's right, it's up by the airport. So if we ever needed to bring people in and out, it's there. He is working on all of the plans, such as escape plans. One of the things that happened with our flood in 2021 is all the roads were damaged except one, Highway 3 to Princeton. You basically could not get in and out of this community for quite some time. And it became very dangerous for people who were trying to do anything. So what our emergency management coordinator does is he comes up with several plans and what happens if this road is blocked or that road is blocked. So we end up with several plans and then falling back on plans to manage to get our community safe. One of the other things that we also did is you have a thing called ESS, Emergency Social Services, which are the group of people that will be immediately called when there is a situation where there's going to be evacuations. And they will set up and they will help people that come in that have been displaced and they will register them. They will get them the vouchers for clothing, hotel rooms, and food. One of the things that you should be doing in your area, if you have an ESS team, make sure that they are completely up to date on the new ERA computer system and that they are ready to go at the drop of a hat. One of the things that we did here is we have given our ESS people uniforms and visible hats so they can be recognized when they show up to an incident, and then they have the stickers on their cars so they can be recognized right away. ESS is brutally important to have, especially when you're having evacuations in your community, because most people are being evacuated at a moment's notice and they're in shock when they get there. One of the things that is on our ESS, we have a full-time chaplain on our ESS that also has the ability to have some they're able to help with psychological trauma, which is nice to have. So that happens. Trauma is very real at an ESS and an evacuation. It's the one thing that you have to be prepared for. The other thing that you have to be prepared for is if you are in an evacuation situation and you're in an EOC, there are going to be some laws and rules that you have to follow, and EMCR will help you get there. This is going to cause some issues in your community. You're going to have to make some tough calls here. One of the calls that had to be made here is that our community was completely closed to everybody in it and you couldn't come back to your homes. Some people were out of their homes for close to 6 months because one of the reasons that our community was so locked down is the sewer and water systems were so damaged that we would not have been able to have the ability to fight a fire if a fire did start in any one of the blocks that were completely closed off. And that brought a lot of animosity out. There was a lot of upset people. A lot of people that were in City Hall that had to make these decisions were vilified, and so were their families. It was a tough time, and it's tough to get through, but these are the calls that have to be made. And the one thing that I would suggest is that you make it very public what you're doing and why you're doing it and why you have to do it. It was the one component that was missing here. I wasn't mayor at the time. There was another group that was running at that time, and they felt it was better not to communicate with the public, and that was probably the worst thing they possibly could have done. What we find is when we have issues now where we're taking people in during fires and everything, is we communicate with everyone and everything. Communication is the main key. Getting the information out and the correct information out, because if you allow the grapevine people to do it, it will be incorrect and it will just cause more problems for you than anything else. So one of the keys is you're going to need big shoulders in one of these incidents, and you're going to need to be able to answer the questions, and you're going to have to be able to push these things forward that you have to, whether you like them or not. And you've got to be able to carry that load, because it's important that you do. One of the other things we talked about was impact on homeowners and residents in the flood area. So the very first thing, after the flood waters dissipate and everybody starts putting their homes back together again, there's basically a flood survivor guilt. Those who were not affected feel guilty that they were not affected. And PTSD is very prominent. People in the flood zones and fire zones do carry a form of PTSD. They get nervous when it rains too much. They get nervous when it's too sunny. They get nervous when there's too much snow. So one of the things that happens there is people are very on edge about how that all works. Insurance was a problem, and there was a lot of confusion on what insurance did or did not do. Many people felt that they were protected because they had flood insurance, but flood insurance is not overland water. A lot of people were denied their claims because they said, hey, look, I've got flood insurance. Now, flood insurance is basically when the water table rises and rises into your basement with no overflow from a river or somebody's pool down the street. Overland water is the most important thing. So I would suggest at this point, if people in your area are not sure what's on their insurance forms, they probably should go see their clerks and find out what they have, because overland water was missed by a lot of people in the community. Now, there is a thing out there in a provincial situation called DFA, Disaster Funding Authority, that will kick in for people who have no insurance. It's a bit of an arduous process, but one of the very first questions is, did you turn down insurance? And if you mark the thing, yes, I did, or did you turn down overland? And if you mark, yes, I did, you're out. So people have to be very aware that DFA will not save them. They need to protect their properties at as best as they can. A lot of people have the attitude that the government will come in, give them DFA and get them back on their feet. That does not always happen. Several people did get DFA. A lot of people did not, because they did not either insure themselves correctly or they bypassed certain parts of the insurance they should have had. One of the other things that we noticed here is a lot of the insurance companies immediately declared bankruptcy. The smaller ones, they immediately declared bankruptcy, stepped away, and left people hanging, and that has resulted in several court cases and legal challenges. Do not ever think for 1 second that insurance will always be there for you. For them, it's a game. They're making money. They need to make the money, and when it's time to pay it out, they find a million reasons why they will not pay you out. The other thing that we noticed too is after the flood, a lot of the smaller insurance companies were being bought out by the larger companies, such as Intact and Wawanesa. And they then started to control the rate of what a home insurance would be. So everybody's insurance, if you were insurable, went up by about 35 to 40%, because you went from maybe 15 choices down to 4. And those 4 groups got together and decided what the market would be. Myself, the insurance company that insured me, it was very easy to deal with them, but they were bought out and was bought out by Intact. They have offered me insurance, but no flood or water, because I have been flooded. But they've offered me flood insurance for $1,700 a month if I choose to pay it. Well, that's a little high to be paying for insurance per month. So I could pretty much rebuild the basement of my house if I had to for that. So they do make it hard for you to become insurable after that. And there are some people that simply cannot get insurance here now. Basically, the entire downtown has become a flood zone. Insurance is an issue after a flood. And the fire situation can kind of be the same as well. Insurance companies become very jittery about insuring people once a disaster has happened. So it's just something you need to be aware of, is that insurance is not always there for you. Impact on elected officials, decision-making and recovery effort. We talked about this a little bit, about some of the decisions that you're going to have to make, and a lot of them will not be popular. A lot of them will be challenged, and you will kind of carry a stigma on it for a while. One of the things that I will tell you from personal experience, if you are a representative at all and you are able to walk through the areas that have been affected, be seen by your people, be there, walk through, put your boots on, put your gloves on. If you feel the need to jump in and maybe help them pull something aside, do it. Let them know that you're there. The entire time I worked on my house for 12 months, I never had an elected official, a director, or anyone come by to see how we were doing it, and it was missed. We really needed it. And even if it's just giving them moral support, you need to be seen. People are looking to you to be there to help them. They're not there asking you to make any commitments. They just need to know that you care and you're there. That is one component that was missing, and it was the one component as we did our debrief in 2023 that most of the people that we had a community meeting with said would have been much appreciated if some of the officials would have been there. Even if the MLA would have walked through, that people are looking for someone to look to make sure that they're being recognized. The other thing we talked about was development applications after disaster. So we're talking about rebuilding in these areas, and how does that look as far as building permits and all the rest of that? That doesn't really change much a whole lot. People are still building or rebuilding in those areas. Well, one of the things that we did is we pulled all of the costs for any kind of development permit or rebuilding of a house that had been flooded. So they did not have to, they did get their permit, but they didn't have to pay for it. And, as long as they were reclaiming their house, the permits fees were all waived, which helped a lot of people move forward. The thing is if it's a new development that's going in, people that are developing have to be made very aware that that area, most likely several parts of it are uninsurable. They have to be aware of the fact that people that are in those apartments or in those subdivisions may not be able to be fully insured because it is now in a floodplain. That changes everything. That also affects your realtors. Realtors now need to know that as well as they're selling a home, and that will affect the growth of your community. There are some parts of the area that were flooded out that will never be rebuilt on. We have to buy the land to put the dikes on, and the land around it will never be rebuilt on again. And what we're doing with that land is we are working with the First Nations on a naturalization project to return that to the hands of First Nations where they can renaturalize, have the the mushrooms and everything grow back, and have some be able to do some cultural digs to find out what's there. And so it's a naturalization project, and it's, I guess, one of the positive things that has come out of the flood after we've made some changes, because the river completely changed its direction from where it was to where it is now. Some of the land that has been exposed has been under the water for close to 200 years, and now it's dry land now. So that is a naturalization project that we're working on. It's called the Stuix Naturalization Program, and it's we as a city facilitate it, but it's being completely run by First Nations. And we're excited to see how it all goes. We actually have the first walk around October the 10th. We go through with the 5 bands, and we go through and we hear what the plans are. So it's an exciting time, and it's exciting because this land at one point in time was very summered on, and then of course the river changed and it was underwater, and now it's back to where it was many years ago. The other question that we talked about is how has climate change changed the aspects of being a mayor? Well, one of the things when you're a mayor and council after a climate change event, you become very aware of things such as weather patterns. We go from El Nino, which is a dry time where we see drought, and now we're coming back into El Nina, which is what we had in 2021, which is more moisture in the hills and more, swollen rivers. So you're very aware of the change of that as well. You have continual contact with the BC river forecasting. You're always on that as well. You're always talking to the forestry about what the drought situation looks like, what the fire situation looks like. The other thing that you also do is you are staying in contact with the province as far as MCSE. and you make sure that in your local community, you have equipment ready to go in case there is a sudden emergency, such as if our water starts to get high. We have 14.5 kilometers of dikes that are gone and they have not been replaced. So we are coming into our fourth freshet since this has happened, and there's been no dike work here at all because of trying to get both levels of government to agree to give us some money on this. Yes, I will have time for questions. I'm wrapping it up. What we're doing with this this whole thing is you got to work with the province because you have to act at a moment's notice, and they have to be able to help you with the funding of that. Because if you move on your own without their approval, then you're paying for the whole thing. So it's just something you have to be careful of. You know what? I think I will leave it for questions because the next thing is what to expect working with higher levels of government. And I have to be honest with you, working with the provincial government and the federal government has been painful. It has not been an easy transition. A minister that puts his arm around you and says that we're here to help you, we will not forget you, is a total photo op. And I don't want to sound critical about it, but we have not been able to get any kind of help from anybody that promised us help. We've put out our applications. They've been denied because of technicalities. We spent close to $400,000. And the problem with this is you start off with provincial, then you get handed off to federal, and then federal has to get provincial to get back on board again. And it becomes an arduous task. And we do have a thing called DMAF, Disaster Mitigation Adaptation Fund. But that is only funded at the will of the federal government when they choose to put some money in it. And if they choose to put no money in it, then there's no way for you to fund anything. One of the things that we had to do here was we had to buy out 29 properties because the flood destroyed them and basically cut them off from the rest of the community. And in order to build our dike, we have to buy those properties out. DMAF, which is the federal government, will not do land purchase. Provincial government is not sure they will. So we've got 28 families that are hanging in the balance for almost 3 years that are still living in hotels waiting to find out if they are going to get bought out. And we can't proceed on the dikes until that property is bought. So you got to get caught in a box in a situation. And that's where you're going to have some patience, a good ROC recovery operations, and people who are very knowledgeable about moving forward and getting your MLAs and your MPs involved, because if you try to do it on your own, you're never going to succeed. So I just wanted to be brief about that. I know we have lots of people that want to speak, so I will just leave it at that, and hope my rambling made some sense, and I will leave it open for questions if there are any.
Thank you so much, Mayor Getz. We have about 10 minutes for questions from our participants. Since Mayor Getz is joining us virtually, please just make sure to put your mic on so that the camera can go to you and we can hear you.
Oh, thanks. Thanks, Chair. Thank you so much for that information. I'm curious now that you've been through this and you're doing some naturalization on the dikes, if you think just what your reflection is on, had that work been done before or different diking system, how much would that have helped in this scenario?
And I think when I touched on a provincial diking strategy, I think that's where we need to head to. The areas of the dikes that broke actually were the tallest and strongest part of the dikes. It's just that we had trees in the dikes, and some of the tree roots had embedded themselves quite in. And then when the water went by, the trees leaned over and the water ripped the trees out of the dikes. And that's where the breaches came in. Had we had a provincial diking authority, those trees probably would have been removed because that was the main problem with the dike situation. But I have to be 100% honest with the amount of water that came down on that night. There's not much that would have helped us, even at dikes that are built at Q200, which is 1 in 200 year. So one of the things you have to understand, you can build dikes back at Q200, Q350, Q500, and Q1000. But every time you go up, it's a massive cost. So if you go from Q200 to Q350, you're looking at a huge cost, and the dikes get taller and larger. And these are called waterside dikes. The other thing that you have to be aware of too is when you are repairing a dike, you get 11 days a year to work on it. That's it. It's called fish window. you only get 11 days. It's not like you can start in the spring and go all the way through. The government lets you know which 11 days you have, and those are the 11 days that you can work on that dike. So when we request $150 million or $68 million, we've made it very clear we don't want it all at once. We can't do any more than $2 million worth of work a year. So, spread it out amongst all of us, because we can't do that kind of amount of work in 11 days. And that's where a little bit of a problem comes, is the fact that you just don't get enough time to work on these dikes correctly to protect your community.
So naturalizing those dikes will stop that conundrum, yes?
The idea of naturalization of the dikes is to, like I've said in the past, the First Nations people have been on the land for centuries. They've seen the rivers change. They know how the rivers change. So naturalization of the dikes that we're working with the First Nations is to have a more protective dike, but a dike that does not intrude, is not intruding on sacred areas and all the rest of that stuff. And like I said, some of this land has not been seen for close to 200 years. So there has to be cultural monitoring on it, because for 200-300 years, this was the confluence of both rivers, and it was lost to high water, and now it's back again. So there's going to have to be some cultural monitoring, and we felt it would be the best if First Nations were in charge of that. All we're doing as a city is making sure the dikes get built correctly, but First Nations have the ability to work with our engineers and help engineer the dike that they feel will work correctly for that area. Yes.
Awesome, thank you.
All right, thanks very much. We'll go to Mayor Wells next.
Thank you, Chair. And thanks, Mayor, for the great information. I know talking with the Mayor of Lytton a few years ago when they had their fire, he expressed the same frustration with the province and the feds, and the current mayor is still having the same experience that you seem to be having. So that's certainly something where hopefully as municipalities we can support each other in that. But my question, we also have had some challenges around flooding here, and one of the questions is around retreat, and currently the city has actually purchased some buildings so that we can actually naturalize, just the same as you're talking about. But I wondered how you see retreat as part of this discussion, like you're talking about rebuilding the dikes in some areas and stuff like that. But how do you see retreat as part of this conversation?
Well, retreat is the most important part of the whole thing to a certain degree, especially when people are being, like, we have 28 families out of their homes. So one of the first things that we did is we took some money from the province, and we bought 31 brand new mobile homes, and we put them in a safe area of our community, and we got them hooked up, and we moved the families into that while they worked on their homes and worked through insurance and DMAF or DFA applications. Some of the retreat that we've talked about is buying future properties that we know could possibly be in the area of being flooded again, and working with those people to see if they would voluntarily like to be retreated out of there. If some of the First Nations have suggested that we retreat all 1,275. Well, we can't do that. We don't have the room to do it. But it's an important part of the conversation. And again, it's an important part of the conversation that has to be with local, federal, provincial, and First Nations. All of those people have to be involved in something like that. But retreat is a very big part of this, yes.
Thanks so much.
Thank you. And we'll go to Director Kerr.
Thank you, and thanks, Mayor, for the presentation. You mentioned communication was really important, or would have been really important. Just wondering if you have any experience or what you feel would be the best methods and formats. Are you talking social media, paid media, all of the above, other ideas? Curious to hear your thoughts. Thanks.
Yeah, social media, like every community, and I'm sure the regional district has a Facebook page for those who choose to read it. That is a very important part to be on. It's also important to be on X and Twitter. The one thing that you want to get ahead of is the grapevine people that will make the story up for you, or thinking that they have the right information. And once that gets out, it's really hard to pull that back. So one of the things that we do here is when we're in a situation, I immediately start talking live on our the same what we broadcast our meetings over so people can hear what we have to say, or we go out into the community and start talking to people. But social media is your quickest and best route to go. And I would suggest that the other thing we have here is a media manager as well, who sets that kind of thing up and gets that going right away and hits all the people that need to be hit. As well as, press is very important, paper and TV to get your message out as well. Most press are very happy to help you with that. But the key important thing here is use whatever you can to get your story out before somebody puts it out for you.
Thanks, Mayor Getz. Really appreciating all this very concrete and specific information you're passing along. I'll take it to Director Hillian next.
Thanks, Chair. Mayor Getz, Doug Hillian, Courtney, I first want to extend my condolences to you and your family and the other people in your community who not only were impacted initially, but from what you're sharing with us, continue to be impacted. And I can't imagine the uncertainty that your people are living with. You mentioned post-traumatic stress disorder as well as flood guilt. And I wonder if you've been able to do anything as a community collectively to support people in dealing with those symptoms.
So one of the first things that happened as we got into this is we worked with MCSC with our emergency services, and we brought a group in from BCI2. We called them the Purple Shirts. They are the people who deal with psychological trauma. We brought in Christian Aid, and we brought in a lot of First Nations elders. When the Lytton fire happened, for example, we took all of Lytton in very quickly. And one of the gentlemen that got here was very overwhelmed. He had spent the night in a culvert because he wasn't sure he could get out. And when he got here, he was a mess, and he was in all sorts of problems. We had an elder on our ESS that immediately did a smudge ceremony for him in one of the rooms, which was uber important for that to happen. It helped the gentleman calm down. And one of the things that you have to be is very culturally aware of not only First Nations, but you also have other groups that have culture situations that you have to be aware of. And you have to make sure those are all being met, because there are people who are going to break down hard when you're at your ESS. So one of the things that with our ESS, we always have a chaplain on board, and we always have somebody that has a good psychological background, because sometimes they can pick people out before they start to have these episodes. It's kind of telling as you're filling out the paperwork. Now, my wife and I volunteer for ESS, and we have for a number of years. And over the years, it becomes very obvious when somebody is not going to be able to work their way through. It's important to have somebody there that can hold their hand or just give them a hug or walk them through it, because most people flee without any kind of documentation. They have nothing. They've got the clothes on their back and they're out. One minute they're sleeping, the next minute they're either underwater or they're on fire. They are completely disheveled when they get there. The main thing is to make sure you've got all the services in place to make sure these people are, you want to be able to take that away from them so they can just focus on getting them somewhere warm, get some food, make sure they're taken care of, make sure their relatives and everything are aware of where they are. Because sometimes they'll even forget that, or they've left their cell phone somewhere, they have no communication. And that's the next thing, you have to be able to communicate for these people. And it becomes a traumatic experience. I've been doing ESS for 5 years, and there's some very good times, like when things are getting better. But at the beginning, it's traumatic, and people break down hard, and you've got to be prepared for that. So making sure that you have the ability to follow all of these cultural situations. One of the things, I'm not sure if anybody's aware of it here, but I lost my granddaughter in the evacuation. She was 6 years old, and she was killed in a head-on crash as she was evacuating the community. It changed my life, changed my wife's life. My wife is no longer the same person that she was. She has post-traumatic stress, like I can't explain. We are constantly, we have her and several other people that are constantly seeking psychological help. Some things will never, ever get better, and some people will never get better over it. She cries every day. It's life-changing, and you have to learn how to work with that, and you have to make sure that you can get these people this help, because without it, you'll lose them.
Well, I can only express amazement at your consistent continued service to your community under these circumstances. Thank you, sir.
Oh, thank you.
We'll go to Director Morin.
Thanks, Chair. Hi, Mayor Getz, Wendy Morin, City of Courtney, and RD Board. Thank you for sharing that really moving story, and my condolences to you ongoing. I have 7 grandchildren and I can't imagine that loss. So my thoughts are with you for sure. Just wanted to talk a little bit about rebuilding on previously waterlogged land. Many moons ago, I was involved with the Red Cross and the ESS team. I was never deployed anywhere, but was kind of ready to go. But I would talk to folks who'd come back from areas from either fires, but often major flooding situations in the US, et cetera. And I have my son and his family was evacuated from Fort Mac, so I certainly understand the impacts of fire, losing your home. They didn't lose their home, but they were out of their home for 6 months. Of course, people who lost their home completely were, didn't go back to Fort Mac for many months after that. And you were explaining how many people in your community were away for a while. What I was told by folks in those situations is that while fire and hurricane damage is horrible, it can be a bit easier to rebuild because you don't have that waterlogged land. So I guess I'm curious if you have someone who's been assessing that to find out, to determine how long it will take to rebuild on that land, and if you've experienced any further complications because of having, the water that is just sitting in the land, you're not able to rebuild on it as quickly as maybe another situation.
Yeah, so basically, one of the things about a flood is as fast as it happens, it retreats almost as quickly. Within 16 hours, all the water was gone. And it left behind 18 inches of alluvial clay. Everything was covered in mud. It looked like a moonscape. The main thing is you have to get that level of clay off your ground as quickly as possible because it starts to compact. And then once it starts to compact, it's really hard to move. The groundwater does retreat fairly quickly. The only problem is what we are finding with some of the houses that were affected. It was the years that they were built in. Some houses that were built in the late 50s here did not have cement foundations. They had 4x4 or 6x6 or 8x8 timbers. And of course, the house is now listed and they're listed sideways, or they've got dips in them, or the dirt washed out below them. So now inspections happen. And one of the things we did have was a thing called rapid damage assessments. And that's where the fire department went through every area that was flooded. And on your door was put a green card if it was safe to go in, a yellow card that showed that you had some damage, but you had to contact the city to work with development services to find out what you needed to fix to get back in, and a red card that absolutely stopped you from going into your home because now it was too dangerous to be in. My home had a yellow card on it. My main floor never was touched, but the basement had 9 feet of water in it. They thought that my electrical box was downstairs, but actually it was upstairs. And my gas main had been underwater, which immediately is a problem. So you have to work, so you get those rapid damage assessments. Many homes lost sides of foundations. The homes were just sitting there with no foundation at all, just hanging above. Some of those homes can never be lived in again, and they will be coming down. And that's where the owner now has to decide, do I rebuild here? Do I not rebuild here? Some people try to reclaim those by putting in different foundations, but it just simply does not work. When a home is hanging for a very long time with half of its foundations missing, you can't save the home. Homes that experienced flood on the main floor, almost within 2 days, mold started to appear. White mold, and then of course the dreaded black mold. And many homes were lost because, and this is why I said, when you are working with the governments and they say to you, it's a total evacuation, you can't let anybody in until we agree that's happening. By the time these people get back to their homes, the mold is so bad they can't save the home. The home has to come down because of mold. You will be accused of them losing their home, and it will happen. And that's where you have to have complete communication saying, here's what we were given, here's what we're doing. So we do have a lot of homes right now that are still boarded up that have to come down because of mold, because the mold took over very quickly. We did have several Christian groups that came to town, Samaritan's Purse, Christian Aid Ministries, that started bringing people in from all over Canada to help gut people's homes out as quickly as possible, get the mud out of the homes, and then start putting in the, it's almost like an insect bomb. It goes downstairs and it fumigates your entire house and it kills all mold spores. Without that, we'd have lost a lot more homes. So some of these homes will never be rebuilt on. The land will be, the homes will be demolished, and then the land will probably be put up for sale by them. Or the city may buy the properties. It all depends what they would like to do. But some of these properties will never be built on again. They'll just remain empty.
Thank you. You've really outlined the complexities of this and why communication is so important. Thank you.
Yeah.
And while I thank you so much, I've just really appreciated all this useful detail, but we've gone a little bit over time on questions. I know there's a light in the room, and Director Mayer, perhaps you can ask during the next round of questions, but I'm afraid, Mayor Getz, I hope you'll feel free to stay on the line for the panel coming up. But thank you so much for your time today. Really, really appreciated what you've been able to share.
You bet, but I'm going to have to leave. I've got to attend TNRD here in 15 minutes. So
I know the feeling. Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I surely appreciate it.
Really appreciate it. And I'll pass it back to Robin.
Thank you so much, Chair. And thank you, Mayor Getz. I'm just wondering if it'd be possible if we could share your email with any of our participants. I may have lost him, but we have his email.
No, I'm still here. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
I can give you my email. If you come to the city page, it's right underneath my mug, but my email is michael, michael.goetz@merit.ca. And what I can do too is if you would like some context from our emergency operation manager and our housing manager and our ROC manager, I can make that happen as well. And they can give you some very good information on how they've moved forward, what claims to DMAF federal and provincial look like, and the hoops that you go through it. And I really wish that you would, because we've kind of been doing the groundwork on that, and there's no reason for anybody to reinvent the wheel. We'd be more than happy to share that information with anybody who would like it, just to help you get to where you need to be without having a lot of problems in the interim. So please email me and I can furnish you all of that, and our directors would be more than happy to be in contact with you and send you what they have to help you just in case things start to go wrong.
Great, thank you. We really appreciate that.
No, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
We are thrilled to have some amazing BC climate leaders with us here in person and virtually today. And we'll be moving through these presentations fairly quickly over the next hour with just a question period after. So I encourage you to save these big questions for that panel Q&A so you can benefit from their expertise. And after these presentations, we'll have a 10-minute break, just so you know that that will be coming as well. Our first speaker is Miriam Shirkat, the General Counsel and Chief Risk Officer for Municipal Insurance Association of BC. Miriam joined the MIBC after practicing civil and commercial litigation. And in addition to her role as General Counsel, Miriam is MIBC's Chief Risk Officer. Miriam oversees the Enterprise Risk Management Program, which includes the identification and evaluation of new risk exposures for the organization. She has spoken on the topic of climate change and local government liability and financial implications across the province. And we are so excited to have her join with us virtually today. And I will pass it over to Miriam now.
Thank you so much. Hope everyone can hear me, and the virtual background was deliberate. It is the MIBC's tree emblem, and it sort of spoke to climate, water and trees, which is part of the discussion today. I want to start off by thanking Robin and Monica, my fellow panelists, and everyone in the room for inviting me to collaborate and learn and share our experience at the MIBC with you. I'll start off by saying that I am a lawyer by trade. I am not a climate expert. So what I will share with you is the MIBC's experience and the repercussions we've seen in terms of climate risk for our organization, which is effectively your organization. Because we are not an insurance company, we are an insurance reciprocal. And that means we are a pool made up of our members, and we have approximately 90% of local governments in BC as part of our membership. I also want to say that when I prepared my slides, which I'm happy to have distributed for anyone who is interested in them afterwards, I was focused on rising costs of climate change. But of course, I didn't have the privilege of hearing Mayor Getz's remarks, and I want to add the societal and social impacts, obviously, that climate risks pose. And obviously, all of our hearts go out to the mayor and the community in terms of all of the things we've heard. So that really helped ground, why we all have to do our part and we all have to care, and how you as elected officials can really be a meaningful part of that change. So if we can go to the next slide, please. For those who have never heard of the MIABC, the Municipal Insurance Association of BC, I don't know if the next slide is up yet or not, sort of sets out who we are. We are your insurance company. We are made up of over 170 local government members. So from small to mid-sized to large local governments in BC, we are your insurance company. So we provide liability and property and ancillary coverage to you. And I want to echo that I did agree with many of the comments and statements that Mayor Getz made about commercial insurers. We are the opposite of that. We came into existence in the late 80s when local governments could not obtain insurance on the commercial market because the coverage was not sufficient, the premiums were outrageous, and that is how most pools in North America came to exist. And that's how the MIBC is here to protect local governments in British Columbia. So we protect local governments. And so we do not have the same philosophy as the commercial market. We don't try to weasel out. In fact, we go out of our way to find coverage. The town of Lytton is one of our members, and we are working with them post-fire. So we have the exact opposite philosophy. Our mandate is to support local government and to be there. And that is why property coverage even exists. Our members, our local government members, every year at our AGM, they dictate what coverage they wish to extend to themselves as a pool, and within our abilities, because we do have a regulator. We are regulated as a financial institution. The BC Financial Services Authority actually regulates us. So within our abilities, and we also have reinsurance, which is insurance on top of insurance. We have some constraints in terms of what we can do, but we have strict marching orders to provide coverage that our local government members need. We can just go to the next slide. So for those in the room who haven't had an opportunity to interact with our organization, we respond to liability and property claims. So of the 170 members on our liability program, a little over half are also on our property program. And our aim is to try to expand that to the best of our abilities. But because of climate related risks, we are sort of limited in our ability to provide property coverage in earthquake exposed areas. And so we deal with climate in a number of ways, both from the claims level to the coverage that we can provide. We also help to identify member risks, climate risks being one of them. We offer risk management tools and resources. And so we can go to the next slide. Before I start sharing the problem from the MIA's perspective, which is your insurance pool, I want to just set the stage that the point of collaborating and sharing knowledge with you is that you as elected officials are a critical source of what the solution can and should be. And so this is the opposite of sort of fear mongering. I just want to explain what claims we're seeing, and for the MIBC's part, what can elected officials do to help with this climate risk and the repercussions we're seeing. So, having a climate forward perspective when you're doing your job would be really helpful. Before I sort of reiterate some of the comments that Mayor Getz made about the fires and the floods and how they work synergistically together to create risk. In many communities, for example, many years ago, without being futurists and imagining capacity issues, many local governments in many communities, not just in British Columbia, have these cross connections. So infrastructure, you have your, so I think I see people nodding, so you know what I'm talking about. Of course, those were never designed with the future in mind. Those were designed at the time before climate change, climate variance was causing the 1 in 100-year flood or the 1 in 500-year flood to occur with regularity, or the expanding population that then put a lot of pressure on infrastructure that was never really designed to handle that capacity. And in a few slides, I'll share with you how that's sort of coming around to impact the bottom line for local governments. So in your day job, if we could have gone back roughly 75 to 100 years and said, I don't know if these cross connections are going to be a great idea in the future, because if the climate does get warmer and we see more, the freshet causing floods, or we, for various reasons, communities could expand post boomers, and we could see too much demand on our infrastructure. Let's build it differently. We'd avoid a lot of problems we see today. But specifically with fires, Lytton is an awful example that sticks in all of our minds. But we're all seeing these fires every year. We know they're coming. And how do they work synergistically with flood? Well, if, a lot of communities where there's the mountain ranges where you have the foliage burned off, well, come spring, we're seeing over and over again with regularity now in a way that we didn't see historically, the floods. And because there's no foliage to absorb the freshet, you now see more flooding, and the culverts just aren't designed for that level of water. So we can just go to the next slide. Focusing on water, I'm going to sort of focus on this, as I say, after Mayor Getz's comments. It seems a good focal point, actually, is flooding is, as we've heard, it's arguably more problematic because of the repercussions of a flood. And so one of the sort of most problematic exposures we're seeing at a claims level for local governments is that in BC, unlike in every other province, our legislation, so the Local Government Act, which has over 800 sections, if anyone has insomnia, I suggest you read it beginning to end and see how far you can get. As lawyers, we love to read legislation, but Section 744, so closing in on the end of that, is a section that is designed to protect local governments from claims in nuisance. Now, there's two ways in a flooding situation that a local government can be liable. One is in negligence, so failing to take reasonable care, but the other is in nuisance, and the law of nuisance is strict liability. The escape of a substance renders you liable for the damage that follows. And the escape of water is one such example. And Section 744 of the Local Government Act, and really it's been a passion project of mine for at least 7 years now, because I can't understand why in British Columbia we have these 3 words in that section that reverse the onus. So effectively, in every other province, if there is a escape of water, a local government is immune. Why? Well, it's that quid pro quo. We, as a local government, are providing to you, citizens, water services, sanitation service. We're providing all of this great sort of service to you, but it's buried infrastructure. So we can't really check it all the time. So that was legislative intent behind this, was to protect local governments from breakdown and malfunction of these things. Now, unfortunately, in British Columbia, in the Local Government Act, the words breakdown or malfunction show up. So what does that mean? That means that I've been general counsel since 2022. I've done defense my entire career, which is almost 20 years. And this section has plagued me because the onus, if someone brings a lawsuit, if someone sues a local government, the city in any other province could rely on a section that would say, we're not liable in nuisance for this because of the section that protects us. Well, in British Columbia, because it's got those additional 3 words, breakdown or malfunction, we now have the onus to establish that it wasn't a capacity issue. Enter climate change, and that becomes very difficult for us to establish. Because if it broke down or malfunctioned, that's one thing. But if it was never built for the capacity that current day circumstances require, invariably, I would have opposing counsel argue, can you establish that this was not a capacity issue? And our mandate in terms of how we run our legal department and our claims is we're, as I said, we're the opposite of the commercial market. We are principled and we are reasonable. If there is no exposure to liability, we run the file all the way through to the Supreme Court of Canada. And I'll take you to a case just in a moment here. On the flip side, if there is exposure, we negotiate a reasonable settlement. And because of this legislation, often when there is a flooding event, and with climate change, we are seeing more and more of these claims, we do end up having to resolve the claims and pay them out. So that is a direct cost. There's the cost of the claim, and then there's the additional costs that come with having a higher claims portfolio. Our reinsurers charge a premium if we become a bad risk, so to speak. Our actuaries add something called IBNR. There's a lot of knock-on effects of having these severe and frequent claims come up. If we can just go to the next slide. So as I've sort of mentioned, really, it's those 3 words that if we could eliminate those, and UBCM, well, which is the lobby group, it's the organization, it's the umbrella organization from which we emerged in the late 80s. They are the advocacy group that deals with these sorts of changes, but we've shared our knowledge, we've shared our claims information to help sort of make the point that from a local government in British Columbia's perspective, this is probably one of the greatest exposures, because as I've tried to argue, local governments should not be the insurers of climate change. And that's effectively what this section renders. So in addition to this section, focusing on floods, because those are the sort of the claims we're seeing a lot of. In your day job as an elected official, when you're looking at development permit application, when you're looking at these future focused developments and plans, really, this panel is going to really help drive the point that you have to have climate risk enter your thought process, your perspective when you're making these plans. We've done a few different sessions on a topic that we call loose lips sink townships. We have had as part of our local government membership, from staff to elected officials, make promises about development in areas that ought not to be developed, multi-million-dollar structures that someone is told, yeah, you can build there, that's going to be great. Well, climate change renders soils sometimes less ideal for certain types of development. And so it's not just floods and fires, it's all sorts of things you do in your day job that will be affected by climate change, and which you have to have in your mind and sort of consult with experts, rely on those who have that knowledge. So next slide, I'm going to try to be sort of brief. I've alluded to this. How does it affect your insurance costs? Well, as I've mentioned, as an insurance pool, reciprocal, we're not like the commercial market. You won't see your premiums go up exponentially. Even if you have a bad claims history as a result of climate risk or other risks, our mandate that we have set for ourselves is to provide stable insurance. We do not want to have our members go back to the commercial market and go back to the 80s where the premiums were so high and the coverage wasn't enough. We want to cover our members. We sort of go out of our way to expand coverage and to provide coverage. So, but the costs are there, and they will go up. They will go up because, as I say, we have reinsurance costs. We have actuaries that have to set rates, and so it will over time obviously grow, but we do try to keep those within a reasonable margin. So let's go to the next slide. So this is where you come in. How can you, as an elected official, help your local government, help BC communities protect themselves from these things? Well, there is, and lawyers love the policy defense. It is capital P policy defense, not just a lowercase. It's a policy we have. It's a procedure we have. What we call a bona fide, a true policy defense. And some of you may or may not have been aware of a decision out of Nelson, Marchie versus Nelson. It went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada. And we haven't had a case affecting local governments in BC on this point since the late 80s. So in the late 80s, we had some decisions. This has sort of clarified the law. So if we can go to the next slide. Marchie versus the city of Nelson, it involved an individual who she stepped out of her car, stepped into a snowbank, suffered some serious injuries as a result of that. And the analysis through the BC Supreme Court and then the BC Court of Appeal and ultimately the Supreme Court of Canada was, in a nutshell, did the city of Nelson, did they act reasonably effectively? Did they have a policy defense? If it was their policy, in fact, to deal with windrows, to deal with snow in a certain fashion. Only lawyers find these types of things riveting to read through. So the entire legal community, we were at the edge of our seats, and this decision did help clarify what does it take to have what's called a policy defense. And what a policy defense is that the courts have said since the late 80s, and now they've clarified it in this decision, if elected officials make a decision, okay, they are elected, the people have elected their mayor and council and to effectively make decisions. That is the voter's choice. So the courts should not interfere with those true policy decisions. So if a local government, and in Marchie, it was found that it wasn't a true policy decision. It was actually operational and it was negligent. That was effectively the analysis that the court was going through, so that it wasn't deemed to be a policy. But if it had been a policy, a true policy that council went through and thought of the social, economic, climate, all sorts of factors, and ideally those decisions are reduced to writing, and there's a council resolution. That's sort of the gold standard, but that's what Marchie has helped clarify in terms of what really is the gold standard to establish that something is a policy defense. And if you have a policy defense, that decision is immune from judicial oversight. The courts say we shouldn't interfere with what the elected individuals chosen by their communities, chosen by their citizens, have chosen to do. So if you know, the sidewalks are a great example, but we could apply this to a climate risk when it comes to floods. Let's look at floods. Our policy, capital P policy, we have looked at the social, economic, climate factors that impact our asbestos concrete pipes. We are going to upgrade those every 5 to 10 years. And here's our schedule of the oldest asbestos concrete pipes down to the most recent updated, maintained pipes. And that's what we're going to do. Well, if there is a breakdown or malfunction of one of those pipes, and it wasn't slated for upgrade for another 2 years, I could, with a straight face and with probably good odds, argue that case in court and say, this local government made a policy decision. Here's the council resolution. Here's what they looked at. They did take into account social, economic, financial. They looked at all the different permutations and factors, and they made this decision. And that road was not slated for upgrade for 2 years. A court will be unable to find that local government negligent, and they will be immune from liability if you have a true policy defense. So if we can go to the next slide. What does that mean for you in your day-to-day job and how you might operate? So again, you can take away these slides. You know, the clarification is that it has to be a core policy decision made by those responsible for balancing priorities and allocating resources. That's your job. As an elected official, you will be making those decisions. And with a climate forward, climate informed mindset, you can do that more readily and with the future in mind rather than just the decision you're making today. They need to be made after sustained deliberation and debate. So the court will want to know, in what fashion was this decision made? Was there deliberation? Next slide. Keep in mind, day-to-day budgetary decisions are not core policy decisions. So it's not sufficient to say, oh, you know, December 31st and we had really blown our budget for snow and ice. So we didn't do that day. That'll be an operational decision and the court will scrutinize that. And these also have to be made, not technical standards or objective criteria, but core policy decisions have to be based on value judgments. So looking at, you know, what did council consider? What did they review when they made this decision? And so the next slide is a takeaway. You know, if you want to ensure that your core policy decisions are sort of gold standard, sort of keep these points in mind. Knowing that it assists us in defending your local government from claims, which is really our aim, because at this point, with climate change, we are seeing more and more climate-related risks and climate-related claims, and our job and our mandate is to keep local governments not just immune from liability, but safe. And have our members prosper. So I will leave it at that and pass it on to the next panelist. And thank you all again for allowing us to contribute.
Thank you so much, Miriam, for that insightful and informative presentation. I will be now introducing our second speaker, who is Alison Ashcroft, the Director of Sustainability with the Municipal Finance Authority of BC. As the Director of Sustainability at the MFA of BC, she is responsible for expanding MFA's strategy and processes for managing sustainability and climate-related risks and opportunities. She has experience working with local governments on making the shift from sustainability and climate action planning to implementation. And we are thrilled she's made the trip up to our valley to be with us here today. And with that, I will hand it over to Alison.
Thank you. I just want to make sure, is the camera working for those online? Good? Okay. Nice to meet you all today. Thanks, Miriam. I love always hearing from you. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about climate risk as it relates to the Municipal Finance Authority and how physical risk of climate change translates into credit risk for ourselves and how that in turn affects your cost of borrowing. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about how climate risk plays out for us and then move over to talk about how with senior government funding, MFA financing can support your investments in infrastructure resilience, provided you're prepared and informed with things like asset management plans and the like. So for those of us, or maybe I should introduce myself first. In terms of my background, I started out as auditor and accountant who, kind of moved my way into green building and climate change. And this crazy woman named Kim Fowler hired me at the City of Victoria to be the first environmental planner or climate action program manager at the City of Victoria when the new director of sustainability was established in that new department. And so for the last 15 years, I'd kind of put aside my finance background and worked on climate mitigation adaptation, both on the corporate side and the community side at the City of Victoria, and then later with large and leading cities across Canada through a peer network. So me back at the Municipal Finance Authority now allows me to kind of bring both of my halves together and bring my finance hat back into my work, which I'm really liking. So for those of you who aren't as familiar with MFA, I'll just give a quick note of who we are. So we're a municipal infrastructure bank. We are a member nonprofit, or a member cooperative, where all of the 183 municipalities across British Columbia and the regional districts are our members. Our core mandate through legislation is we're your exclusive long-term lender. We issue bonds to the capital markets as a means by which to finance those loans. And so we're a AAA rated bond issuer. And we also provide some short-term lending, and we invest ourselves in sinking funds to repay our bondholders. But we also offer pooled investment products to local governments as well to invest your reserves and other dollars. So we are the largest municipal bond issuer in Canada. We are sort of only rivaled by Montreal and Toronto. We issue over $1 billion in bonds a year, usually through two issues of about $500,000 a piece and a couple of refinancings. Our AAA rating is what I was going to skip actually this slide. Our AAA rating is a factor of our credit strength. So we're seen to be very reliable and safe investments. We have that in part through sort of legislative backstops that were established, like we have the ability to have direct taxation authority should we have a default. We can tax every single property in British Columbia to make ourselves whole. There's also joint and several liability at the regional district level. So if one community were to default on their loan, the entire regional district and its members would again make us whole. And then there's certain other things like the fact that you all can't run deficits and you have to balance your budgets that keep investors really happy. So that financial health is what keeps our low credit rating, which keeps our low cost of capital for your borrowing. So you guys all know this, but I just wanted to fly through sort of how the cycle of financial health and well-being works for your communities and yourselves. So, starting with your taxpayers and your ratepayers who elect you, but also provide money into local government, yourselves then making those decisions and governing your communities and making those investments in critical infrastructure and the services you provide, which then provide these critical services to your residents and businesses, which allow them to prosper and do well in order that they can continue to support local government. So when we're talking about the investing side in critical infrastructure, there's a number of different ways that infrastructure is financed or funded. Obviously through your property taxes and user fees and DCCs and whatever reserves you can allocate. Also looking to senior government contributions. And then finally, as the residual as necessary is where you would come to MFA for your financing. So some of the challenges that come with that is that you have you're experiencing rapid growth and climate change, which is accelerating the need for your new infrastructure and expansion and rehabilitation of your aging infrastructure, but also you have limited revenue sources. You've got a lot of downward pressure historically on keeping those rates and fees low. And so maybe your reserves are a little less than adequate. And the senior government grants have been uncertain and are continuing to be even more uncertain. And we're seeing more of a shift from the federal government through FCM towards loans as opposed to grants. So in terms of how climate risk cascades down to yourselves and then to MFA, I'm not going to go through the physical risks because Miriam talked about a bunch of those, and I know Ben's going to talk to their hazard risk and vulnerability assessment they've done for RDN. But just to highlight sort of the many myriad of ways that directly or indirectly these hazards can impact your financial health, which then in turn obviously impacts our potential credit risk as perceived by our investors. So you can have service level disruptions, asset impairments, you have uninsured damages. So, all of your linear assets are uninsured assets. You're having to replace these assets faster because the lifespan of them isn't lasting as long. In terms of your community, you may have a lower assessed property values if they're seen to be at a higher risk. And your tax revenues or user revenues and collectability could be challenged, become challenging in the event of a disaster. And obviously the liability claims for nuisance or negligence that Miriam was talking about. So lots of indirect ways, not just the immediate damage losses that could potentially impact your financial health and those of your local community and economy. So when we look at MFA's long-term loan portfolio and the risk that we have, and I'm talking about the climate-related financial risk we have. So what is that credit risk from our lending activities? We've got over 5 billion in loans distributed across the province. I've circled the ones here for Vancouver Island, but it's proportionate here. There's almost 1 billion of loans, long-term loans here on the island, which is proportionate to your population in the province. And so when I have to now look at, well, what is the credit risk to us within our long-term loan portfolio? I have to look at risk as a function of likelihood and consequence. And that likelihood and consequence varies by region and community. So the probability of certain hazards is more likely in certain parts of the province than others. But also the consequence could be quite different depending on what your physical exposure is of your assets and the vulnerability of those assets or their condition, but also the vulnerability, the social vulnerability of your residents and businesses. So to give you an idea of how BC looks to investors and to others, this is from the Bank of Canada last year. So this shows the red columns show where we have both financial vulnerability as well as high exposure. So that's where your consequence is deemed to be, or your risk is deemed to be quite high because you have a lot of exposure and a lot of financial vulnerabilities. So you can see that BC is more than 2 times the national average in terms of that high financial vulnerability. We have, a lot of residents with very high mortgages on properties that are deemed to be very exposed, essentially. So this is where I kind of wanted to pivot to, what your investments in resilience realizes. And there's 2 aspects to it. There's what you do that can adapt your own public infrastructure to extend the life of it and reduce costs and damages, but there's also what it enables when you do that. And that enables more resilient infrastructure services, those critical services that your community relies upon, and ensures that there's fewer disruptions. But it also supports and reduces the vulnerability and impact of the people in your community and your local economy. So those big enablers go well beyond just the protection against your own assets and those damages. And so there's this actually, I don't want to take credit for this. This is not my graphic. This was actually out of a report from South Africa, and I just thought it was quite brilliant in looking at sort of this triple dividend that comes when you invest in infrastructure resilience. So there's the benefits when an actual disaster hits, and that's what people talk about a lot, I think. And I think we don't talk a lot about, you know, these are good investments even regardless of disaster. And hopefully you don't have one, right? We're not actually hoping for the disaster and when we're making these investments. So obviously when the disaster strikes, you're saving lives, you're reducing the number of people affected, the damage losses, your infrastructure is protected, and you protect your economy from losses and disruptions. But regardless of disasters, there's obviously all the co-benefits, social and otherwise. But you're also, you know, protecting your community, promoting business and capital investment, increased employment, supporting household and agricultural activity, et cetera, and protecting those land values for your taxpayers. So I wanted to think about what, coming here today and speaking mostly with elected officials, what are the things that you in particular, your leadership is required for beyond what your staff can do, and in order to enable your staff to do what they need to do. And so a lot of the time we talk about response and recovery from disasters, and I wanted to flip and talk more about preparation and mitigation. And Dan and your team are obviously going to talk a lot about this in your climate action strategy and sort of some of the foundational cross-cutting work and activities that will prepare you for climate change, as well as mitigate that risk of damage, either acute damage or just chronic impacts of climate change. So, you know, the first is just that creation of social infrastructure. So we know that we need to be really integrated and collaborate both within your organizations and beyond your organizations. And that's not necessarily how we're set up right now. We can be quite siloed. And it requires real investment as someone who really believes in networks and peer networks, and your peers are your best consultants a lot of the time. It's not always valued because it seems to take a lot of time, and it's hard to measure impact of that collaboration or that peer exchange. Development of these multi-hazard risk and vulnerability assessments and all of the stuff that comes with the Emergency Disaster Management Act, which is overwhelming for sure, but they're all foundational to making sure that you are prepared and ready and have done so with your regional groups and your other key partners and critical infrastructure providers to ensure that, yeah, you're ready and you know what you're going to do in the event of. Then there's some sort of advocacy stuff. So the Mayor from Merritt made reference to, you know, disaster financial assistance, and obviously Miriam talking about insurance and lack thereof in some places. So right now, both the federal government and the provincial government are reforming that disaster financial assistance. So at present, your residents and businesses are getting about 40 to 50% if they're eligible, like the mayor said, for recovery dollars, and you're getting about 90 to 95%. Those percentages could change as they reform this. They could change what you would be eligible for. There's certain language in there referring to, you know, that this is for unexpected losses. So at what point does something stop being unexpected? If it's happened frequently enough, not sure, but really getting clarification on what that's going to look like and how that's going to impact you and your residents, I think is really, really important. And it's certainly when I have to look at our risk and where I see tipping points or big game changers, the ability to access affordable insurance, both for yourselves and for your residents, is a big one to your financial health and the financial health of your communities. And the other is the disaster financial assistance. Will you be made back whole or close to? And so the other thing is that the federal government, of course, has established that they're going to create a national flood insurance program for those 1.5 million homes that are in floodplains. And there's already been some criticism that it's taking too long to come out, but it's also perhaps a little inadequate in terms of the dollars that they've set aside for that. And then the other question is, does there also need to be a similar program for wildfire once we get beyond flood? On the mitigation side, obviously it's making those investments in capacity of your gray and green infrastructure. And then also building redundancy in those in power generation for those hospitals, for your fueling stations and telecommunications that you'll need in order to run a proper EOC and response. So how do we do this, when everything is coming at us everywhere all at once in terms of new legislation with the EDMA, the Emergency Disaster Management Act, but also just, asset management and everything else. So really, I think like we need to have way fewer distinct and disparate processes and teams and start taking, a much more concerted effort in like the planning and integrating climate risk into all of these and having all of these documents and parties be talking with one another so that your emergency management is tied in with your climate adaptation planning and your risk assessments, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, everybody knows this, but I'm just putting it down on a chart. Like I'm just looking at like all the different parties that are there and the people who are adjacent to local governments like ourselves, like MIABC. Within Asset Management BC, there's a number of partnerships there. PIBC is in there along with the two of us, as well as BC Wastewater Association and others. So there's already networks or groups that convene that could help, I think, to make this a more coordinated effort. I think I'm going to end on this slide. So just looking alone at what is required of the Emergency Disaster Management Act and also increasingly the requirement for asset management plans and policies to be in place, asset management policies to the point of Miriam in terms of having a policy defense, asset management plans, because they're a good idea to figure out how you're going to prioritize and allocate resources because there's not enough money or human resources to do all of it, but also because it's now becoming sort of a lot of the funding that's coming down through the feds, like the Canadian Community Building Fund that is administered through UBCM, is to support building up those asset management plans, but to improving on them, but is also because at some point those asset management plans will be required to be shown that you have a process for prioritizing the investments that you're going to make and that they're going to deliver on the resilience needs in a future climate with future growth. So in planning, how do these things that you have to do anyways through legislation, how are they going to support the work that your teams are doing by integrating climate risk into all of your master plans and OCPs and into your financial plans, informing your land use policy for your new housing needs assessments, which you also need to do for Bill 44. For funding and financing, increasingly, you'll need to do this obviously for making more informed investments, but also because a lot of the project funding requirements from GMF, Green Municipal Fund, the province and feds are also requiring a lot of this work to precede these applications as a precondition of funding. And then for even preparing for your long-term borrowing requests that go through municipal affairs and then follow through to us and into a referendum in order to have, to get to a yes on a referendum. I think a lot of this work will really inform your communities as to how you're reducing risk and building resilience through these borrowings that you're wanting to do. And finally, these risk assessments, a concern I have personally, just from having worked in local government, is that these risk assessments get held internally. And really, you have so many partners that need to understand how your infrastructure is going to behave under different circumstances and what they need to do to make informed decisions themselves and be prepared. And likewise, you need to know what telecommunications providers and BC Hydro and Fortis are doing in order to make sure that your assumptions are going to play out truthfully also. And so there's a real push towards making this information more transparent and collaborating in their development, but also making it transparent through more climate-related disclosures. And I don't have time to go into it, but there's, we're now being, we're we're now being asked to voluntarily align with international sustainable disclosure standards, which is part of what I'm preparing for our year end this year, where we really have to list out how we've identified, assessed, and how we're managing climate-related financial risk. And similar disclosure requirements are coming for the public sector. That is one way in which you'll end up sharing that information out with your community and also with other partners that you need to have act in unison with you. In addition to the more detailed risk assessments at certain asset levels or for different specific hazards. I think I'll leave it there. You don't need that. Right?
Thank you so much, Allison. We really look forward to hearing more from you during the panel Q&A. With that, I'd like to introduce Ben Gesselbrock, our next speaker. Ben is a City of Nanaimo councillor and a director for the RDN board. He's held a number of leadership positions, including on the UBCM executive, on the Environment Committee, a Vancouver Island and Coastal Community Climate Leadership Plan Steering Committee, that's a mouthful, AVICC Special Committee on Solid Waste, and co-chair of the Climate Caucus Working Group on Zero Waste and the Circular Economy. He also holds a position on the RDN's Climate Action Technical Advisory Committee. And I would also like to introduce Kim Fowler, who will be joining Ben. Kim is a professional planner and sustainability expert with over 30 years experience working with local governments in Canada. She is best known for project managing the redevelopment of Victoria's Dockside lands, which was awarded the highest LEED Platinum point total in the world for the first 2 development phases by the successful land sale developers. She has authored a book on Dockside Green's 18-year innovative project history. And Kim is currently the manager of sustainability and energy with the Regional District of Nanaimo, and the Planning Institute of BC awarded Kim the Individual Outstanding Achievement Award for Innovation and Advocacy in 2022.
You just press the button on the base of your mic, it'll allow me to turn it on.
Our regional district, thank you. Sorry about that. Thanks for having me come up here, and also grateful that Kim Fowler, who's our Director of Long Range Planning and a big champion in terms of our climate action planning, has come to join us as well. Definitely up here to support and share any information that would be useful to you folks as you're going through your planning process. I think there was a big push in our regional district. A lot of work had been done on climate action in terms of adaptation, resilience, and emissions reduction before the 2018 elections, but there was definitely a lot of focus on the climate during that time, and our community has been very engaged and wanting action done in this area, and elected quite a progressive group of elected officials in the city of Nanaimo and the regional district to move forward this work. And so, you know, through making it a priority in our strategic plans for both our board and our city, and then going through that process of how do we actually increase our effort around preparing for the changing climate and also doing our fair share of emissions reduction. And I think for myself, coming into elected office, I've got a background in biology, worked in arboriculture, climbing trees. You start seeing all these big cedar trees drying up that you've never seen before. And things are definitely changing out there. But there's a lot more focus, I think, on emission reduction, at least on our council. And that was an initial big push. And so a lot of programs and initiatives were put in place, but now seeing and learning more about asset management and the basic services that we run, water, storm sewers, roads, you realize that there is a lot of infrastructure that we're responsible for. And at the city of Nanaimo, we did asset management analysis, and we have something like $1 billion deficit in terms of our infrastructure renewal. And then you start hearing the stats like, oh, you know, infrastructure is being damaged 3 to 5 times more frequently than before because of changes in climate. And then you start hearing, and maybe there was maybe 4 or 5 days above 30 degrees on average in 2000, and then 2024 it's 10 days, and then the projection in 2050 it's 16 days. There's that damage is increasing. And I gotta have to drink a bit of water here, sorry. And it's a serious cause of concern. And this whole week been pretty busy, and I've been dropping. I got one son who's 2, an only child, and at his grandmother's, and the excitement and the joy of my grandmother hanging out with this little guy, and just hearing the mayor from Merritt speak about the tragedy that happened to his family, and it definitely, like, the risks involved are very real. And I'll share my screen here just on our risk assessment. The city of Nanaimo. Okay, hold on here. So when we did our risk assessment in 2019, the number one risk is forest fire. And I think it's only a matter of time when it's our turn here out on the coast. And then overland flooding, major wind events. As an arborist, it's crazy the trees that are coming down, and like big trees. Trees grow well out here, and there's a lot of big trees in our residential areas, and it's a significant risk. And the cause for chaos when power outages, and then all the infrastructure relying, hospitals, on power, it's significant. So I think as elected officials, there is an incredibly large amount of responsibility placed on our shoulders to make sure that we are being very proactive in addressing these risks and taking responsibility for the essential infrastructure that we do have, so that it's functioning when we do need to respond to disaster. It's wild hearing, that if there was a fire on those blocks, they didn't have access to water for a certain amount of times for whatever reason, that infrastructure failing. And there's a lot of things that are in our control. One, so that we're building communities that are climate ready, and not contributing further to the issues around being so reliant on the amount of fossil fuels that we're burning. We can't forget about the emission reduction end of it, because that's causing the problem in the first place. But also that we're making sure that our infrastructure is ready. And so planning, investment, asset management, there's not really you can't have a climate plan without an asset management plan. And we're starting to do one, and we have one in Nanaimo, and saying that, there's $1 billion deficit. We're having to put 1% every single year additional tax before we even do the rest of our taxation increase. There's always a 1% increase. We've been doing that for 8 years, and it's going to continue on to make up that deficit. I don't think we have an asset management plan for the regional district yet. And so it's wild. Kim uses very colorful terms sometimes, wagging, wild ass guessing when it comes to budgeting. And that's not even taking into account the modeling for battle hardening our infrastructure and having it adaptive with the changing climate. I'm hearing stories in the city of Nanaimo that when we're having flood events, the diameter of our storm drains in some areas aren't big enough anymore to handle the flow of water. My mother lives on a bank, in the north end of Nanaimo, and there's an area that's like blowing out because they didn't put the drainage in properly. They put a ton of houses on this bank, like Eagle Point and on that area. And now in these rain events, it's blowing out the bank, creating further erosion. And so we have a lot of power in terms of development approval areas, building code, and regulation. And then also too, how do we retain moisture in our landscape? And how do we manage our natural assets, which is a whole nother asset management program that we're in the early stages of getting around. So At our regional district and the city, we have been putting a lot of things in place. And there's a lot of plans and programs around working from the risk assessments and looking at floodplains, you know, dealing with our corporate emissions, reviewing all our zoning bylaws to making sure that they're aligned with developing in a way to reduce emissions and looking at our disaster preparedness. And you know, the details are available in our plans to look at. The point is that there is a lot on the go and it's very comprehensive. It's kind of everywhere. What was that movie? Everything all at once. And when you're trying to make a plan and looking at the dizzying amount of things that you can do and that you should be doing, there is a big need to be strategic because you can quickly, you know, give yourself a panic attack and then during budget time, give your community a panic attack for the drawn resources that's actually required to address this in a proactive manner. So a couple things that we have been doing just in our planning that quickly share. I think we're already way behind time, so I'll kind of let your City and Nanaimo did an official community plan that was really integrative, but I think this interdepartmental approach, because the implications of climate change and the planning required and the asset management, it crosses all departments, all services, and you can't be working in silos. And so our official community plan process really was a process in the planning that allowed for a lot more interdepartmental communication. At the regional district, we've got a climate action technical advisory committee that you're always trying to, you know, get the biggest bang for your buck. So stacking functions, you know, when we're looking at an intervention, is there that overlap between adaptation and climate mitigation and these co-benefits? Looking at what things are already being worked on and how can we enhance that? And having interdepartmental process in place where the staff teams are meeting regularly to address different challenges. On the political end, it is really important. We do have a strategic support in all our planning, which is educate to mobilize. And I find this process here very proactive. It's like we need to ensure that we're continually educating the elected officials, our staff, and most importantly, the process so that there is a public awareness of why this is important. And I do notice in the last 2 years with the affordability crisis and this, there is a little bit less talk about climate adaptation and mitigation. And when you look at the degree of risk, it is really a penny wise, pound foolish thing that's happening. And it's important that we're not letting that happen at our board when we're looking at decision at budget time for the staff that's needed to actually deal with this very complex reorganization. And it does take awareness and education. And I think this is an example of educating to mobilize, but then it continues on to the public as well, so that the public is aware of what we're doing to elect the political officials that can continue making those wise decisions. Dedicated staff. I know that things get moving in our regional district and our city when we have staff dedicated to the task and it's not off the side of people's desks. And super grateful for Kim Fowler here. That's been a really champion. And I've noticed in the last 4 years, things really accelerating since herself and another dedicated staff person on the climate action front have taken place. And one more gem of wisdom here. I'll piece through these 4 pages of there's some important things around prioritization that it is good to do at the committee level. Like I think if you're looking at reviewing your action plans and that, having a committee is useful. We had this climate action technical advisory committee. It did have people from the community that were experts and professionals in areas like hydrology, forestry, engineering, building experts that provided input, but it also did have members from the elected officials, 2 or 3 that can be very educated in what's going on and be champions at the board table and provide that political feedback. And it did allow for good plans to be created and that political support as it moved through the process. And doing the prioritization, because you get these like lists of actions that need to be taken. It can't all be done at once and funded at once. And if you bring that to the board table without a prior prioritization, it just becomes like a wild bun fight. And you want to avoid that and do that prioritization before. And there's some really good filters to prioritize through that are great and are within our plan. And that's what we did. And that was very helpful. So I think we'll leave it at that, just given the time. One, just 3 gaps that we definitely have noticed, and it was brought up here, is that we've been running these plans and prioritizing and looking at the different areas of service. At the city of Nanaimo, we had this official community plan that really did integrate a larger vision around climate action and put in policy at the different levels so that we're putting it into all the lower level action plans. The regional district, we don't have that as much. And a board level, a corporate level policy that basically says climate's a huge risk. We need to address it. These are the risks that's involved. And this is the process that the board goes about discussing it and determining the level of service. And that's sort of speaking to what Miriam from the insurance about the policy defense and make sure that happens, and that having at that high board level across all services will allow for departments and all the other plans to align underneath it. And I think that alignment is critical so that you don't have, one group working in isolation over here, and then all of a sudden you get a building built and planned for, and it's like, what the heck were you guys thinking? And that does happen in government. And so it's important, not that. And then I do think the wildfire is something that we haven't been on top of, and we've just been lucky on the coast, and that's been a gap. And then also the asset management. We're starting to work on a natural asset management plan, but even just the asset management plan for the regional district, we don't have it. We don't know what our asset, our deficit for renewal is, or the climate modeling of like what we need to be doing to improve it. So maybe I'll quickly pass it over to Kim if there's anything that you wanted to quickly add to that, and then I think we'll get into.
Yeah, thanks. And I think just when we were talking about risk, when we talk about climate and financial risk, they're interrelated. So what we've gone from is a 1 in 100 year return period to a 1 in 25 to a 1 in 5. So we're seeing both the increased frequency, which that is, and the intensity of those weather events, along with the incremental sea level rise. So that's what those changes have done. And when we combine things like we're all concerned about housing, and CMHC just came out with a report a week ago saying there's $5.8 million, 8 million houses needed by 2030, that's a few years away, to return to 2004 affordability levels. That's 3.5 million more than currently being projected. And our current rates of construction are dropping by 44% across the country because of feasibility issues. And we get asked as local governments to please reduce our DCCs, our fees. We already heavily subsidize existing development and a lot of local governments don't have asset management plans, and that those assets are being damaged 3 to 5 times more by climate change. And we're liable if you don't design infrastructure to climate standards now. There's enough case law on that as well. And I really think that's the big piece, is that we adapt or we're going to be an expensive victim. And if you've seen, we've already had an example where you've had those climate events in municipalities and local governments. That's all you do for 3 to 5 years. Whatever you had before is gone. Whatever priorities you had, whatever things you had, you're just in recovery mode for that period. And that's expensive, both socially, economically, and environmentally. So I really think those are the key pieces in terms of understanding. They said you have to look at it from a triple bottom line. There's a climate change, an environmental impact, which has a financial impact, which has a social impact. And making sure that we do the outreach, as Dr. Giselbrecht said, with our communities is really key. Because we can do our own corporate resilience and do our asset management plans and that sort of stuff. But the outreaches that I've done, you go out to communities and they said, oh, I had no idea that you have that issue about financing. That we fund 60% of the infrastructure in this country on 8 cents in the tax dollar. That is not sustainable. And that's FCM's #1 issue. I sat on a provincial committee on dikes in 2003. And the next year they dumped all of them just down onto local governments. They ignored everything we did. I have PTSD from that. And you know, how dare they? That's a lack of duty of care, in my opinion. And we need to start being better advocates and not being so polite, because the financial situation that we have for our communities and how we manage things isn't sustainable. And climate change is increasing that risk. And that's really the key piece to it. And I think there was also the Insurance Bureau of Canada just came out and said the insurance coverage this year is $7 billion. And that is something like, broken all records for insured losses this year, $7.7 billion in claims so far and counting, just 10 times the inflation adjusted average from 2001 to 2010. Yeah. And that flood event, over 600 people died in 2021, 65% of them over 70. It's a social equity issue. $9 billion in estimated total cost of that November 15th, 21 flood event. And just in Sumas Prairie alone, 150 square kilometers farmland was inundated. 630,000 chicken died, 420 cattle and 12,000 hogs. And the Fraser Valley Regional District, the province of British Columbia, and the city of Abbotsford are being sued by those farmers for gross negligence. So there's, hope that just helps.
Very helpful. We
I
bring
think that's
Kim
a
in to
great
scare our
place to-
board.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kim. I think we'll leave it there just so we can all take a break, maybe for 10 minutes, stretch your legs, get a drink, whatever you need. So I'm just looking at the time. Can we please be back here for 2:35 so that we can have a Q&A period with our panelists? Thanks so much.
Amen a couple of times. Educate to mobilize, and that was penny wise, pound wise. Amen. No, not church. Preach, brother, preach.
Okay, folks, we're a couple of minutes after, so if you can find your way back to the table. Lisa. All right, just gonna ask you to find your seats because I know we probably all have a lot of questions and there's only so much time without keeping people from their evenings. So give one more minute. All right. Well, I just want to thank everyone who presented today. There was so much useful information and great to already see kind of overlaps and commonalities and between the presentations that were being made. I know I had to cut off the questions before and I'll hope not to have to do that again, but we've got about a half an hour for questions. And I'll just turn it over to people in the room, and forgot to mention earlier, we also do have Director McCollum attending online. So it's an unusually shy group. Perhaps Director Mayer, did you have a question from before?
Thank you so much. And thanks to all the presenters. My first question is for maybe Miriam and Allison both. I'm just hoping to hear from you some advice to local governments on the really kind of difficult conversation to have about the properties that are being identified as being in the floodplain. So we heard from the mayor of Merritt what happens after, but what happens when we know before? What is the liability and risk of doing nothing versus mobilizing to buy properties as some folks are already doing?
Allison, do you want to chime in or?
Jerry?
No.
Uh,
I think Miriam, I think Allison's suggesting this is a question for you.
Sure, well played, well played. I'm not in the room. So, I mean, when Allison and I go way back, so no, I mean, our advice to members, not just on, property in a floodplain or is the local governments get into trouble in our experience, and claims arise when they don't turn their mind to something. When it's something that they ought to turn their mind to and they don't. So whether it is, property, whether it is a policy you're passing on, sidewalk inspection, whatever it is you're dealing with, putting your head in the sand is the worst thing you can do. It is when we haven't turned our mind to it, because if you're looking at litigation down the road, the question a judge is going to ask is, well, did you turn your mind to that? And if not, why not? And, back to the sort of atmospheric rivers we're seeing and the 1 in 100 year flood happening with regularity, we cannot get away from acknowledging the risk, whether it is property in a floodplain, whether it is updating maintenance on really aging infrastructure, pipes and roadways and things like that. So my advice always is have the discussion, think through all of the permutations, document. It's sort of back to that policy defense way of approaching things. Think it through, talk it through, and document the decision. If the decision is to do nothing, and it's an informed decision to do nothing, that we can defend. Doing nothing is always an option. If you do nothing because you don't know what to do, or you didn't bother turning your mind to it, or there were other things, you know, that you were focused on, that's not gonna sort of pass muster. If, on the other hand, you are looking at all the different things, and that's sort of why the policy defense really even exists. It's because unlike Starbucks, local governments work within the confines of the taxpayers' dollars, and they're working within budgetary sort of limitations. So someone slips and falls in a Starbucks, have at her. Someone slips and falls in a rec center in a local government in British Columbia, we have a pretty strong argument that if we did the best we could, it doesn't have to be to that commercial standard. So if we decide to do nothing, regardless of what the topic is, but it's an informed decision and it's a decision to do nothing because our resources needed to be deployed elsewhere, well, that we can sort of work with. But being aware that properties in a floodplain and simply just being aware of it and doing nothing further, that's where you're gonna potentially open yourself to exposure, legal exposure.
Okay, thanks, Miriam. And anything, do you want to add anything, Allison?
The only thing I would add, and this is still very much a moving target, is in the Emergency Disaster Management Act legislation. And with the regulation in development right now, there are some new there's some new opportunities for borrowing in response and recovery that didn't exist before. So, and we're still trying to understand from the province what that might look like, because it impacts, you know, it would be through us, but it says currently that land acquisition is an allowable project for borrowing, and under that emergency response borrowing, that it could circumvent or doesn't necessitate electoral approval in those instances. So it's really to be seen what that regulation is going to look like. And there is an Emergency Disaster Management Act working group that has been struck. It's met about 4 times so far, and it'll be in existence through till the end of 2025. It's being co-chaired by UBCM and the Emergency Management and Climate Readiness Ministry. And it has 10 local government representatives, primarily staff, and in some of the smaller communities where they don't have dedicated staff, I think they have a couple of elected officials. The closest one for you all would be the Cowichan Valley Regional District. There's a woman named April who's on staff that is on that working group. And some of those questions I think are really important to put to them. My understanding from talking to the EMCR staff before they went into silent mode a couple of weeks ago was that the compensation and financial disaster assistance regulation, as well as the regulation for local authorities' responsibilities under that, would be coming out in mid. I think they said at the earliest April, but mid-year. So it is coming fairly quickly, and wanting to make sure that some of those concerns are definitely addressed and we understand what the implications of them might be from a cascading perspective.
Thanks. And did you want to follow up, Jen, given you did not get to ask before?
Thank you so much. That answered my question for them, but if I may just ask a question of Ben. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about fuel mitigation on private lands. It might be too nerdy of a question for this time, but it's private lands around our watershed. And so we're a little bit different from Merritt, where they were talking about fuel mitigation on Crown land.
So in our discussion at the Climate Action Technical Advisory Committee, the issue of fire came up and the risk. And one of the big issues that we face is that all the land that basically encircles Nanaimo and in the regional district is privately managed forest land. And I think there is a big chasm to jump in terms of being able to have data and information shared more readily between the private owner, like the private forest company, and the regional district. And I think that was one of the main areas that we want to focus on, so that we can get a handle on what is actually in there and what is the level of risk and what steps are being done to take care of it. But maybe Kim can fill sort of the gaps a bit more in that.
Yes, sorry, we've done, staff have done an analysis of publicly owned land, and we're allowed to have that information. We're not allowed to have the privately owned land. And so that is something that we are lobbying to have from a provincial perspective, but then also continuing to meet with the forestry companies to share that information, because it's a shared risk. But said, and a fair amount of outreach with the community as well, trying more education than regulation. And that tends to go a lot further. And there's a lot of funding out there for fire smart approaches. So they will do a lot more than we can do, they collectively than we can do individually. So that helps too. Thanks.
All right, thanks. And Ben, if you want to just hit that button, and Director Hillian.
Thanks, Chair. I'm going to get political for a moment. I was particularly struck by Ben's comment about how the economic crisis of the last couple of years has turned people's minds away from climate issues. And, you know, we're all aware that public opinion is fickle. I'm old enough to remember that the 90s was going to be the turnaround decade. But I'd be really interested in the technical experts that we have here. We're getting a lot of letters from people right now encouraging us to join the Sue Big Oil campaign to try and build a class action case to recover costs. And I'm just wondering how you would advise a municipal council who was receiving those sorts of requests, given your understanding. I'm thinking, Marianne, of your understanding of the world of litigation and you know, insurance and costs, and I'd appreciate any advice that others on the panel might have as well. Thanks.
My advice is always it's restricted under the agreement that I have, that I am only to give legal advice on active litigation matters. So I don't propose to tell you to do or not do that. I would always say, you know, if you are affiliated with a local government that has a city solicitor, I would always, you know, discuss with them. Many of our
that kind of goes without saying, but I'd just be really interested in your personal opinion.
You know, I'm, you know, if it's just my personal opinion, I can tell you that I alluded to a presentation we've done a number of times. And it's the one entitled Loose Lips Sink Townships. As an elected official, you're in a position of power, and I think you need to exercise that carefully, judiciously. So, you know, it's a difficult thing to say. Depending on your views on those things, you know, in terms of climate, in terms of, you know, the legalities, in terms of morality, there's a lot of things that go into, you know, signing up on these platforms, because then your views become the views of your local government. And so they can be fraught with risks that you don't foresee at the outset. I would be cautious in doing so, but that is my personal opinion, not the opinion of the MIBC. I would, you know, and again, you are representing, as an elected official, the community that elected you. Do your personal views reflect that of the entire board, council? You know, again, we really, I've already told my colleagues back at the office, we really do need to sort of do the presentation on Loose Lips Sink Townships. And again, it's at the staff level as well as the elected level in terms of local governments.
I guess maybe more to the point, where do we get the money to pay for climate mitigation? You know, just given the infrastructure deficit that we already have that's been highlighted here today. If anybody else wanted to comment on that.
I did have some notes on that, and it is a huge issue. I think there's a lot of responsibility that local governments do have, and there's a lot of costs. And I do think that we are in a situation now where the revenue structure for government it's skewed, and we're relying on the property tax, and income tax is much more equitable, and yet it's, you know, controlled by the provincial government, and we're reliant on them. And I think that at the heart is a discussion that is happening, you know, at UBCM and at FCM, but it's something that does need to be resolved, and more attention and advocacy and pressure from local governments being put on it, because, you know, it's involved with many things, you know, emergency response, housing, climate change, climate action. And the point that I was making in the presentation is that one of the key strategies of any climate action plan, I think, is collaboration with your neighbors, and I think that shared advocacy and strategizing between regional districts and local governments is critical, so that we can, you know, have enough political force to put the pressure on to make that a political issue at the provincial and federal level, to get changes on it. And it'll be a battle, but I really see that that is all issues are starting to like focus on that question of money.
I can say one thing that can you hear me? Yeah, one thing that I'm seeing and hearing. So, you know, as our federal government and our provincial government are running quite significant deficits, and they're looking at the debt service levels of local governments and seeing that there's plenty of room still for most all communities to take on more debt. It's not surprising then that a lot of the contribution agreements going to Green Municipal Fund are now coming in and how GMF is designing their programs are using grants for studies, feasibility studies that basically get the foot in the door for the loan that would follow with the capital project. Now that might be useful in other provinces. In this province, if a community wants to take a loan through FCM, GMF, because sometimes the grant is so significant that it can create a concessionary loan and it actually is a decent deal, it may be better than what we can get in the capital markets. Rarely is that true. And it also has to be balanced with sort of some of the reporting requirements that would be more excessive for those. But I mean, we help people look at that all the time, because again, like Miriam, we have no skin in the game. We want you to get, you know, financing for the lowest possible cost. And if that's through them, then that's great. But for the most part, there's a narrative that we need to unlock private capital, or that we need to bring in lenders from cooperators or Addenda Capital or all these other places who are looking at investing in public infrastructure for climate resilience as something that they're interested in getting in the game on. And there's just no way that the interest rates or the rate of return that those investors and lenders would want could possibly be better than your member co-op, because we take no profit. So, and we're already pooling and aggregating to the tune of over $1 billion a year. So, you know, and we're AAA, so it just can't get any better than that. So, I mean, the one thing I would say is like not to be drawn down a path of believing that the way you're going to fund that infrastructure is superior through these magical financiers who are going to come in and whatever. You've got a better situation with this 50-year-old company than any other province, you know, including Nova Scotia, who lends to their municipalities through their own borrowing power, and Quebec as well. But it's not good. You can't borrow better. So the point is, you don't want to be borrowing as much. And so how do you push back on the abandonment of 40, 30, 20 or 40, 40, 40, 20 or whatever the numbers were, you know, that it used to be on all of those, and question why it is that you're being asked to take a much larger share and burden future generation, your future taxpayers, right?
Okay, thank you, Alison. That was really helpful. We'll go to Mayor Minions, please.
Thanks, Chair. I think it's a relatively quick question. Just a question for Miriam. With MIABC, is there any type of quarterly or annual risk report that municipalities have access to see if there's any kind of trending or shared climate cases that are happening, and kind of in one place we can see what the trends are happening year over year? Obviously, we know there's more happening and more risk to municipality, but is there any type of annual report that is released on what some of those precedent cases that are being settled look like in summary for us?
That's a great question. We don't currently do it in that format. What we do is on a member by member basis and request, we can aggregate and summarize the claims profile of each individual member for that member. We haven't followed it can be difficult from a litigation standpoint to look at a claim or litigated matter and decide, is this climate related or is this, some of them have the ilk of climate and others don't. So we haven't looked at it at that granular a level. Our regulator, so the federal regulator, OSFI, has guideline B15, which is requiring federally regulated financial institutions, banks, to record and report climate risks. So for us, being a provincially regulated financial institution, the BC FSA has what's called its Natural Catastrophe and Climate Related Risk Initiative that is really coming down the pipe 2025, 2026. And we will be recording and reporting on these things. So that's in the works. But at present, if a member is interested to know what is the sort of spread, what's our risk profile, where are we getting claims, that's something we do routinely for our members. That's sort of part of our risk management advice that we give. That's also, again, to Allison's point, we're not for profit. Our members get risk management advice tailored to local governments. That's the business we're in. So that's sort of what we bring to the table. So absolutely, if your local government is interested in that, just reach out to us. We have an email address, askUsAnything@miabc.org, and we get that information turned around fairly quickly. It's a great question.
All right, thanks. And we'll go to Mayor Brown.
Thanks, Chair. So we in the Village of Cumberland have just completed our climate action plan and are updating our OCP at the same time. And it seems, after listening to all of you, that it's quite critical that we integrate our climate action plan with our asset management plan, which we do have. And we have an inkling of moving toward natural assets in that plan, or in the policy related to that plan anyway. And so just wondering if there's any tips or tricks for doing that work, that integration work. Yeah.
So we're just entering year 8 of what we call Sea Level Rise Adaptation Program. And what we've done to date is essentially update the floodplain maps for the 3 rivers, only the 3 rivers for which we have provincial floodplain mapping for. We've mapped 188 kilometers of our shoreline and done 6 scenarios of sea level rise on it. Those are now codified in our floodplain management bylaw, and a new development permit area that determines a new flood construction level. And some of them are quite significant increases in that flood construction level. And we did do engagement, which we usually do for these bylaws. We didn't have a huge attendance, but it said we had some interesting conversations with people, and that's really the key to explaining where the circumstances are that they're dealing with that. And then we've done, I think I was talking to you at the break about the natural asset management inventory, condition, and risk assessment is done for 208,000 square kilometers. And so we now have all of that classified. And we use that in an official community plan and electoral area F to develop tree and wetland protection, environmental protection development permit areas based on risk, because we are in a high risk area determined by the province, which is the coastal Douglas fir biogeoclimatic zone. And then we've also pulled all the data from our 14 years working in drinking water watershed protection program, along with a new updated aquifer protection mapping. The province finally updated it after 20 years. And we now have aquifer protection development permit area in that official community plan. So I think also, as said, from the official community plan, you have some key areas. And those are areas to pull out along with your strategic plan in terms of doing that. But from the discussion we've had earlier, and even the question about should we do this or should we do that? You need to, under that Marchi decision, have a conversation at the highest level, which is the board or the council table. And you have those very good discussions, which you have on good nights, that are what are those and what are the costs? What about the environment? What about society? What about, we need that culvert over there fixed, as opposed to doing that thing over there, or this one over there, or that one over there, and we don't have enough money. We don't have enough money, and we have significant funding debt, we've been told in our asset management plans, and next week, the Public Service Accounting Board is going to come out with new standards on reporting for environmental, social, and governance, ESG. And they're going to be coming in for local governments, and that's going to be a requirement of those professions, so the accountants. And we're going to see those, so they're asking for this data. And so you've done land use planning. Have you actually done that? So the next two stages of that sea level rise, or it's changed its name, but is a broader climate risk analysis, is that we're doing a high geohazard analysis and a slope erosion hazard analysis. We're going to take that information and say there's actually certain areas within the regional district that we're going to have to reassess for land use. And the issue that's already been pointed out, there's people who are homeless in these areas that have already been flooded. How much can you afford to keep buying them out? You can't. There's a limit, more appropriately. And so these are the difficult decisions that you need to have the conversations about. And those are the ones not only will protect you if you codify it in a policy, and I am working on a board policy on climate action to try and address those issues raised under the Marchi decision. And they really have to be done by functional area, which we're talking about, those different areas, because you have finite resources. Where are you spending them? And how did you discuss that? Where did you make your decision? How did you make your decision? Did you record it? And did you implement it? Then you have some defense as our MIABC, which I've had the privilege of working with, developing this board policy over a couple of, last year and a half on working on this. And this is the conversation you need to have. We have finite resources. And what were the risks? This is what we talked about today is what are the risks? So have the conversation, record it, make sure it's comprehensive, and implement it. And I guess it said, because Allison always tells me I come out with scary stats, small, it's very good. I like to do that. Very good. Small local governments or tiny local governments can make tiny actions. So we're not talking about this massive, huge thing that's going to take you 3 years. You don't have 3 years. By the time you finish doing the analysis, it'll have changed. You don't have that time. We have to be nimble. So if it's the culvert, it's the culvert, right? And did you do the culvert? Did you have the conversation at the council table? Did you talk about all those different, did you record it? And did you implement it? Yeah. If you didn't implement it, did you go back and say, oh, we can't do the culvert anymore. It's now the road intersection, the overpass. That needs to be worked on, or it needs to be something else. But from having been an inaugural member of Asset Management BC since 2008, our community expects us to fully maintain and fully replace at the end of the useful life all of our infrastructure. That's our roads, our water, and our sewer. That's the basic function of local government. Those are the backbone of our community. That's our basic function. And those are being grossly underfunded. I think the estimate is at least 400 billion across Canada for local government. And then that CMHC report I referenced says 600 billion for the new housing. And even if the federal and provincial governments to ramp up, I've suggested their housing agencies and partner with developers who can't afford to do it on their own and build hundreds of thousands of new rental units across the country because that's affordable. I've written this in a Planning West Journal article. They still have to come to local government for one thing: infrastructure. And do we have it?
So we were thank you so much. We're supposed to end a few minutes ago, but once again, okay, Director Mayor was the last person with a light on. Is it super quick by any chance? Okay, then we may have to let that go, but I appreciate you being understanding yet again. So I just want to thank all of you for everything you presented today. It's as I said, it's been incredibly enlightening, and it's lots to stew over as we receive our climate plan. I think right now I should just hand it back to Robin, and she'll know what the next thing is.
Thank you so much, Chair. Now to move on to our speaker, Daniel Hegg, who is visiting us from Calgary, Alberta. Dan is going to give us an update on our climate action strategy. As I mentioned, Dan is with Stantec Consulting, and he has expertise in integrated carbon, strategic energy and water management, sustainable ROI business case development, full value accounting, climate risk assessment and planning. And in addition to providing strategy and policy advice, Dan has prepared multiple climate resilient strategies to help guide both private and public sector organizations in sustainability and climate decision-making. We're very lucky to have Dan with us today and as our lead consultant, and I will now pass it over to Dan.
Thanks. That's a mouthful. It's like AI wrote that for me or something. I just want to share my screen. You need to give me authorization. Just go ahead. It's not sharing though, is it? I'm sharing. Oh, is that interview? Yeah, let's stop sharing. Says I am.
You have two screens, if you dragged it sideways, okay.
It's got a couple screens up, that's the issue.
Just take on duplicate maybe or extend.
No? That was sharing.
You see, there's three choices in showing them on.
Yeah, maybe take the first one.
Yeah, try that one. Try that one, no? Yeah, it's
Can you grab that screen and drag it to the side?
No.
See if it, no, okay.
All right. I don't have any more windows.
no.
You can email it to me really quick, I can pull it up.
Okay.
Okay, so it's just start. Okay, so it's L Dennis. LDENNIS.
There we go.
That's it.
Will it firewall me?
Sorry?
Will it firewall me
It should be good.
for the 15 megs?
Oh, okay.
Try it.
Let's see.
What about direct connection?
Why is it?
I don't know.
There's an issue where he sees three screens and it gets confused between which screen should be picked.
Because you're.
You tried them all.
Yeah, I've already tried them all.
So Dan, you're welcome to go ahead without, and you can just describe in detail what each slide looks like or would have looked like.
Yeah.
I'm really, I apologize for the fact it's not cooperating with you. It's kind of your call if you want to keep problem solving or.
Well, we're just gonna,
Oh,
We're gonna send.
oh, okay. Well, while we do that, I'll at least talk to you about what I'm gonna talk about, so.
thank you for multitasking with that.
So I'm gonna provide you folks with an update on what we've done since we last met in January, who we've engaged with, what we've heard, what the climate action strategy framework is about, and what we have planned in terms of next steps. So just as a quick recap, the climate action strategy is really to formalize the CVRD climate specific vision and related goals for the CVRD to work towards. The framework itself is orientated around three aspects: climate mitigation, slowing and reducing greenhouse gas emissions; climate adaptation, building resilience into our infrastructure and systems; and then disaster preparedness. We can implement as many measures as we want into our infrastructure. We can build our pipes bigger, but there will always be an impact. There will always be a storm that's just too big for us to handle, and we'll need to have disaster preparedness plans in place. In terms of timing, I had this really cool graphic, but I'm not going to try and describe it. So in January, we last met in January. At least I wasn't here, but a colleague of mine was, and we kicked this whole project off. I should have a link. Okay. We kicked this project off in January. We did a soft launch with CVRD staff and member municipalities and let them know what we're doing and why. Oh, should I pull it closer? Okay. In January, I mean, from February to March, we did a jurisdictional review. We looked at what peers were doing in terms of climate action, not just in BC, but across Canada and in the US. We wanted to see who's doing what, how are they doing it, and where they're being successful or not. During this time, we also looked at the greenhouse gas emissions inventory that we presented to the board back in 2021. I'll just let you drive. Yes, we did we looked at the 2021 emissions inventory and forecast to see how the emissions currently are and how they're going to change. And then lastly, we also did a climate profile on the region. So we looked at how climate parameters like heat, precipitation, wind are going to change from the 1980s to 2020 baseline over the 2030s, 2050s, 2080s. On that sense, I don't have a lot of happy information to share. The risks, the changes are real, the changes are significant, and the risks are going to increase. Between March and October, we went out and engaged with students. We engaged the public through an online survey. We hosted 6 workshops with CVRD staff members and CVRD member municipalities. And we also engaged with specific community groups and not-for-profits, Vancouver Island Health, all to understand how climate change is impacting them. What are they doing right now in terms of climate action, where there's gaps, where there's barriers. And then we spent a lot of time talking about what actions do we need to do and who needs to help and what are the barriers in the way. Yeah, almost there. Through that process, we came up with 124 actions for the CVRD to consider. That's a lot. It's not all going to get done. So to help sort of narrow those down, we completed what we call a criticality and impact assessment. We wanted to know which actions were critical in the sense that they could reduce emissions significantly or increase resilience. And we wanted to know which actions had the greatest impact. The outcome of that is we got that 124 actions down to about 63. In those 63 actions, we have 12 that we feel that are must do, and I'm going to talk about those later. And then that's left us with 51 actions. And last week, we met with CVRD staff and member municipalities again to present these actions to discuss, do these make sense? Which are most important, and have we missed any? The next steps for us is to develop the climate action strategy document itself, share that out with CVRD staff and members for feedback, with the goal of getting a document in front of the board by January 1, 2021. It's giving, yeah, it's the wheel of death. If you believe in karma, I did something terrible to someone in IT in a past life. This is not anything not new to me. I wanted to show you the sort of GHG emissions trajectory based on the 2021 inventory, but I can't. But what I wanted to
It's really worth it. I've seen the graphics.
It's so big. You need a flash drive?
I think we have IT help in the room. USB stick?
Where is my? Do you have one? Your Bob does. Sorry, I was getting a snack from you. Usually I got a flash drive here. Let's see what I got.
Keychain. Yeah.
Keychain.
I also got a little thing for ejecting your SIM card from your phone.
Yeah.
That's like 50%.
It's not fitting. It's weird.
Want me to?
There you go. Oh, no, we can't do that. Okay.
Yeah, just say you don't encrypt drive.
No, my security won't let it. Oh, where did I save this?
Sorry, Chair, I should have. I left at the wrong time.
There it is.
There it is.
It's happening. So I'll talk about the greenhouse gas emissions for the CVRD. 75% of the emissions comes from buildings and transportation, which is no real surprise. The remainder of the emissions result from small amounts of agriculture, forestry, and land use and waste. If we start looking to the future, we're going to see that emission profiles start to decline, and that's largely because of the federal CAFE standards, which are related to fuel efficiency in vehicles, as well as the ban on the sale of fossil fuel vehicles in 2035. If I was able to show you my chart, you'd still see that transportation emissions are still sitting there in 2050. And that's because people like to hold on to their cars for 15, 20 years. We also have supply chain issues with electric light duty trucks. And we have technology challenges that we need to overcome with heavy duty vehicles. So we're going to have some emissions still. We're going to have to figure out ways and technologies to get people out of their cars or switching to low carbon fuels. The key piece that I wanted to show you in my chart is underneath that bar chart, there's a whole nother bunch of bars that are negative, meaning that there's emissions being sequestered and stored. And that's because the CVRD has a huge natural land base of forests, wetlands, grasslands that are providing a significant benefit, not just in terms of GHG emissions, but also cultural benefits and other ecosystem goods and services such as flood mitigation and whatnot. I wanted to point that out because, oh, we got it. Woohoo! Can you just advance? Yeah, there should be a bar chart.
It's right behind the screen. Okay.
Right there while I'm listening.
All right. Nice. There we go. Yeah, so as I was saying, the CVRD has a large land base, but it's at risk to the the risk to development and at risk to the effects of climate change. And that's really important to note and think about when we're thinking about trying to achieve emission reductions, getting to net zero or nearly net zero by 2050. Having these land resources are really important to achieving that, as well as to reducing the risks related to climate change. As I mentioned, our team did a climate profile on the region. So we have almost a dozen climatologists that go in and download meteorological data from your local weather stations. They take the data from 1980 to 2020 and process it and organize it into climate variables such as temperature, precipitation, and we use different thresholds to put bounds around the data, such as number of heat days over 30 degrees. So what I wanted to point out here is your climate's changing significantly. What we're going to see in the next few years, and we're already seeing it now, is your summers are going to get a lot hotter and drier. The spring, fall, and winter seasons are going to change significantly. Fall and spring will extend in duration, but they become more variable in terms of temperature. Folks might think that's a great thing in terms of agriculture because we get more growing degree days, but the reality is there's going to be more uncertainty and more temperatures hovering around zero, which negatively impact crops. And we're already seeing that on the southern part of the island. Precipitation overall for the entire year is going to increase. It's going to decrease in the summer, which means there's going to be a lot more precipitation in the spring, fall, and winter seasons. Because of the nature of climate change, we're expecting our typical design storm, or a 1 in 150 year event, to change, to become more frequent and more often. I can't remember what that says. So we're shifting from a 1 in 50 to a 1 in 10 to a 1 in 5 by the 2080s. So your typical 1 in 150 year storm is actually going to become like a 1 in 100 or 150 year storm. And that's what we haven't designed for in terms of our infrastructure. So that exposes our infrastructure to significant risk. We'll also see, we're expecting to see an increase in a number of extreme wind events in terms of intensity and duration, which can have a human health impact, as well as cascading impacts to other utilities, such as power. Because of the nature of the hotter, drier summers and the lack of precipitation, there's an increased risk of forest fires in the region, as well as across the province. So there's a direct impact from fires, but there's also the indirect health effects from smoke-related exposures. And naturally, we're also seeing an increase in sea level temperatures and rising sea levels. I was reading an interesting study a few weeks ago where they're predicting the great white sharks to be able to show up in Vancouver's harbors by the 2050 because of the temperature change in the water. So if you're thinking about that, we're going to see significant change in our sea level, sea life as well. So that was kind of the bad news. I wanted to talk about some of the interesting things that we've heard and what we're doing. So I wanted to start with the elected officials workshop and just recap on what we heard during that. And what we heard was that there's a strong commitment to climate action and the time to act is now. I like the time to act is now. There's a saying that I always tell my kids is the best time to plant a tree was 25 years ago. The second best time is now. And the same goes for climate change. In terms of climate action, when we spoke with you folks back in January, we asked about what needs to be focused on. And we heard about the improvement of energy efficiency of existing buildings, constructing new net zero buildings, getting people out of their cars into sustainable transportation systems, embracing the circular economy, protecting natural and enhancing ecosystems and integrating nature-based systems into our assets, and recognizing that nature is an asset class and should be incorporated into our asset and capital management systems. We talked to you folks about barriers. We heard barriers related to the resistance of climate change, limited resources, and we hear that all the time. There's always going to be a limit in staff and funding resources. We're going to have to prioritize apathy, fear, and burnout. We asked about what the success looks like, and that requires funding, collaboration, partnerships with other governments. So internally, externally, we're looking at the province, and it needs to include everyone involved. Climate change overlooks, it does not care about political cycles. It does not care about political boundaries. It's going to happen, and we need to all come together. And that was sort of our takeaway from our last DOF meeting. As I'd mentioned, we talked to the public as well as youth, and I'm happy to report we had a surprisingly high number of youth participate in our survey. So we had 103 youth provide responses to our survey, and 107 public participate. We asked them several questions, and I'm just going to share some of the results with you because I think they're really important. In terms of how concerned are you about the impacts of climate change? We had a large number say that they're very concerned or concerned. There's a chunk that were neutral, and that was mainly the students, because I don't think there was some feedback in the sense that they just didn't know how they were going to be impacted by climate, or they weren't being impacted by climate right now. But as they become adults, we know that will shift. Which climate impacts have already affected your day-to-day activities? I'll talk about the community meetings that we've met with, but we're already hearing about the impacts. Heat, drought, flooding, changes in natural environment are already occurring and happening more than once. We asked folks about what actions they're already undertaking to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and a large focus right now is around building energy efficiency and reductions that way. There was a balance between people were also being more active in terms of transportation, trying to avoid food waste and consume less. So there's parcels of that circular economy already starting to show up. How prepared are you for climate change? This one surprised me. I thought we would have significantly lower numbers, but as you can see in the chart, we have almost 75%, I'd say 70% of people saying that they're prepared for the effects of climate change. And, we reflected on this as a team and thought, well, we've been through heat waves, we've been through atmospheric rivers, and, there is that sort of big earthquake mentality preparedness. So we thought maybe that's why people feel they're more prepared than not. This question was really interesting. So what would help you prepare for the impacts of the changing climate? If we look at the first two sort of parcels of that pie, 42% of people want to know what their government is doing as it relates to climate change. And my takeaway from that is people are wanting to know, are they being protected? Are we protecting their assets, their livelihoods, their children, their schools, the communities? If we take the next three pieces of the pie, they're all related to give me more information. Give me more information on how I'm going to be impacted. Give me more information on how I can prepare. Give me information on how I can reduce emissions. What was surprising to me is the financial incentive slice was quite a lot smaller than what I expected. And that might be simply because people don't know what they need to do. And then, obviously the penny will drop if we start giving that information, and the request for support might come from that too. We engaged with the community stakeholders or interested parties. They were invite only, and they range between not-for-profits, related to the environment, public health and well-being, and agriculture and food security. We asked them similar questions that we asked CVRD staff and member municipalities about how are you being impacted? What are you doing? What do you need? Overall, we heard that there's strong support for climate action, reducing emissions, and disaster preparedness. The impacts, we heard from these folks that the impacts related to heat, sea level rise, and precipitation are occurring and notable and very disruptive. Vulnerable populations, environment, and the agriculture are being hit the hardest right now. We asked folks about actions. What do we need to do? And we, as you can see in that list, it was related to improving emergency preparedness, proactive management of watersheds and water sources. This is a very important piece for many folks. Having water, having access to water. If we're thinking about Bill 44 and the impacts that's going to have on population, we don't actually know if we have enough supply of water. If we factor in climate change, such as drought, precipitation, wildfires, that can change what volume of water is available. The protection, acquisition, protection, and restorations of lands was something that came up a lot with these groups. Requests for Indigenous-led acquisition, protection, and restoration. Similar to other groups, we heard about just improving building energy efficiency, active transportation. But dissimilar from other groups, we heard also about protecting food systems and food security. The amount of local food grown here is significantly low. And if we're thinking about disaster preparedness, there's a risk. And then improving public awareness on climate change. It goes back to what we heard from the public. The public wants to know more, and we need to share more. And we're also heard that from our groups here. Last group. So we had, like I said, we held 6 workshops with CVRD staff, member workshops around emergency management, buildings, transportation and land use, agriculture, urban forest and natural ecosystems, water and waste. Like all groups, like everyone we've talked to, strong support to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase resilience, and prepare and have disaster preparedness. Interesting with this group is we heard a lot about barriers and challenges, such as competing strategic priorities, the siloing. We've heard about the siloing from our other speakers today. Siloing is preventing coordinated climate action and communication. There's a lack of structure, tools, and resources to inform and enable staff to make decisions. And that's sort of leading to the next point, which is we're not seeing consistent integration, climate change integration into departmental service plans. And unfortunately, something that we've come across, or maybe fortunately that I'm bringing it up, is we're not seeing climate change being factored into the organization's corporate risk management system at all. Same with business continuity plans. One of the things that we've struggled to get through this process was any information on the enterprise, on the CVRD's enterprise risk management system at all, which begs the question of where is it at and who's managing it. So if we're thinking about risk management, these are sort of key pieces we need to take away. So the climate action strategy framework. The framework is structured in line with adaptive management principles. We're looking to establish a long-term vision of what climate action in 2050 looks like for the regional district. It contains sector-specific goal statements, which basically work us towards fulfilling that vision. And below this are targets, like a GHG emission target and resilience target, followed by specific actions. And then finally, indicators and monitoring systems to be able to report out and track progress. We've drafted a vision, as you can see here. We're going to share this vision and document out with staff. But naturally, if you read it, it's, we're aiming to be a sustainable region of urban and rural communities achieving net zero emissions by 2050. And that's going to be done through collaboration to protect and conserve water, land, energy, and resources, while ensuring that we're achieving, we're building our economy, supporting our resilient natural systems, as well as community resilience. I've got that adaptability in the face of climate challenges, because we're not just talking about impacts. We have physical impacts, but there's also going to be transition-related challenges that are going to have to be dealt with. So if we're thinking about our building stock, our residential building stock, which, you know, there's a large chunk that are rented, how are we going to get to those to nearly net zero? What is that going to look like? How are we going to deal with equity issues for the people of our lower socioeconomic status? As I had mentioned, as part of the same framework, we have proposed thematic goal areas, which are going to help us organize our key regional actions around agriculture, food security, infrastructure, utilities, urban forests, buildings, transportation and land use, public health and well-being. You'll notice in the center of that image is corporate governance and asset management. And we've heard a lot about that today. The importance of having our house in order so we can have it be ready for climate change. And this goal area is meant to connect, to hold our baked in actions that will help start addressing the systemic issues that we've heard from staff in our workshop. And so this is our list of baked in actions. So I'm going to go through each of them sort of one by one, provide some context to them. So the first one is to establish dedicated oversight for climate action at the board and senior management levels. If we think about the board or elected officials' role in providing governance and oversight, strategic direction, ensuring accountability and managing risks, and acting in the best interests of our stakeholders, or in this case, communities, it's really critical that we need to bring forward and include climate action awareness at the board level to address the significant risks that were being presented by climate change. And this is nothing new. We're seeing this in the private sector as well. Private sectors are now being required to report and disclose their financial related climate risks. And it also requires that boards be involved in the management of these risks. So a lot of private organizations, privately traded companies are now either getting a board member with subject matter expertise in climate change and risk management, or they're looking to develop an advisory committee so that they can be advised on what risks are present and how to manage them. At senior management level, for many of us in the sort of climate change sustainability realm, I've been in it for 20 years, Allison longer. We've developed lots of climate action plans, and many of them have sat on the shelf. And the reason for that is, you know, you've got engineering, you got planning, I've seen it in human resources and parks leading climate action, but these groups or departments don't have the adequate authority to implement the structural change that we're looking for in an organization. So what we're seeing now is we're seeing chief sustainability officers in the private sector. We're seeing chief climate action officers. Now in the public sector, Vancouver has developed a chief resiliency officer. And the recognition is that we need to have the level of accountability and authority to implement the structural changes that are required. And that's going to require coordination. We're going to suggest creating an internal steering committee to help support that individual, to foster the cross-departmental collaboration that's going to be required. Because we're going to need to integrate climate resilience and GHG reduction targets into all municipal capital asset plans, community plans, and bylaws. This is being done. The City of Edmonton has spent the last 2 years unpacking all their bylaws and evaluating them for climate risks, adaptation opportunities, and where they can influence GHG reductions. Sustained funding is going to be required as well, as you've heard from our speakers. And that's going to have to be that's sort of something that the organization's going to have to figure out is how do we get funding? We're seeing some municipalities develop their own climate action funds. We're seeing municipalities allocate a percentage of budget towards climate adaptation for infrastructure systems. Ultimately, I think, where Ben was going is we need to reevaluate how we charge for services. So that's sort of the top down, and the bottom up is also required. We're going to need to invest in our staff. On the private sector side, we are seeing, typically when they onboard new employees, you get trained in health and safety, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now there's training on climate. We need to, and for, that should be for everyone. And then for specific staff in engineering or planning functions, we're starting to see staff get specialized training in climate risk and resilience assessments for infrastructure. Edmonton, Vancouver, Toronto, Ontario, Calgary are all training their key staff on climate vulnerability and risk assessments, so they can make the informed and important decisions on what needs to change, what the risks are, and what needs to change. And these cities are providing tools to their employees. Calgary is a great example. Calgary has developed climate risk profiles for every single community in Calgary. They've provided training for staff, and they've developed a tool to help staff walk through completing these risk assessments. So that when a capital or a major renovation project comes up, it's a requirement that staff go through that process to figure out what the climate risks are, where they can reduce those risks, and how. We need to proactively conduct regular greenhouse gas emissions inventories and climate vulnerability and risk assessments. We need to know where things are going in terms of projections, where the risks are, more importantly, who's at risk and what's at risk. The risks are changing. Climate is accelerating in terms of changes faster than our models predict. We weren't expecting to see heat domes so soon, according to our climatologists, but we are. We're seeing them. They're happening. With the new legislation for emergency management and asset management, climate vulnerability and risk assessments are coming anyways. So it's important to be proactive. The next point is integrating climate resilience and GHG emission considerations into corporate risk management, business continuity, planning and recovery processes. We can have all of these different components built in, but if we don't have a feedback system that brings all these risks up to the tracks and brings all these important risks up back to the board, we're not going to be in any better position. And then lastly, we're going to need to develop communication and disclosure plans. The private sector is already being required to disclose climate liabilities, and it's not going to be long before municipalities are to access the capital. Will soon require something like a climate vulnerability and risk assessment for whatever project you're looking to achieve. So next steps, we want to bring these core actions, the EMT, and we want to talk about implementation. So what's required to support the implementation? Who needs to lead the action? Who needs to support? When does the action need to be completed? And what sort of financial resources are required? And then after that, we will be, like I said in my earlier part of the presentation, we'll be drafting up the climate action strategy. We'll be just distributing it for staff to review and comments. And again, with wanting the goal of bringing something to the board before in January or Q1 2025. So that's it for me. I'm happy to address any questions. It's like drinking from a fire hose.
All right, we'll take a question from Director Helene.
Thanks, Chair. I appreciate being able to sneak this in. Somewhere there's a disconnect between what we're here today talking about and the fact that this province may in 2.5 weeks elect a group of people who deny all this stuff to lead our government. So where are we failing on the communications front?
Okay, that's all yours, Dan. Go for it.
In fairness, he's living in Alberta now, so.
Hey.
With all of the juice. We see right now.
I think people will believe what they want to believe, because of their life experience and perhaps past traumas. I don't like to talk to people about climate change. We don't need to point a finger at who did what and when or whose fault it is. But I do like to talk about what's changing and what that means for us in terms of our daily lives. So if we can start framing things around, speaking to the audience about what matters to them. If we want to talk about greenhouse gas emissions, I have a business background and an ecology background. So when I talk to business people about reducing greenhouse gas emissions and sustainability, I don't talk about the benefit of hugging trees, although it's important. I'm talking about the benefit, the financial benefit of saving money through climate change and climate action. In terms of greenhouse gas emissions, that's kind of an easy one. Like, you're going to save money on your utility bills. They're like, yeah. Climate action is a little harder, but we're working to develop estimates to say, if you don't do this, it's going to cost you this much. But if you do the investment now, this is the differential, and that's your return on investment. So I think that's sort of the approach we need to take. And there'll always be somebody in the background who says, well, no, you're wrong. But we gotta get the majority at least on our side.
Couldn't agree with you more. And I do think emphasizing co-benefits and pointing out the economic arguments and leading with that can often be really helpful. Like, my just observation is just that people are stressed enough financially that they can't see past those immediate needs, and that's fair. That's completely fair. But so if one can speak in terms of understanding those needs, then I believe that the figures on investing in advance on climate action or something, the return on investment is like somewhere around 1 in 10, so or 10 to 1. So there are economic cases for making those investments.
And that's what we're seeing with our clients on the municipal side is, help us figure out the cost of avoiding the damages, so we can take it to our board and council with actual numbers, so we can talk the language.
All right, well, I'm kind of amazed. Jen, did you want? I think I still owe you a question from earlier, so please feel free to go ahead. Otherwise, we might somehow end up finishing 5 minutes early. Go ahead.
Gosh, sorry. I just really appreciate this plan. Actually, I'm super impressed and really excited by seeing the Chief Resilience Officer kind of becoming a bit more mainstream, and particularly the discussion about ensuring that the people who need to have the agency and the power to make the needed structural changes, like that, how essential that is to this work. So thank you. The questions that I still really feel are salient is how we work with the tension between biodiversity and ecosystems health and GHG management, and what this looks like in real time when we've got housing needs and growing population. So I'm just wondering, because you've done all of this scanning and you're working out front, what you can share, what you could leave with us to think about in that regard.
In terms of protecting natural systems, but balancing development.
Yeah.
Oh, man. There's a big push for infill to avoid the degradation, further degradation or impact on green space. That's the big push that we're seeing in sort of in the US especially. They don't want more sprawl because sprawl has other negative socioeconomic impacts on populations. We're also seeing organizations start to figure out how to recognize natural assets as an actual asset class in their asset management systems. And putting monetary values around that. So like if we think about New York Catskills watershed, they were one of the leaders in ecosystem valuation back in the 90s. They had the choice between building a water treatment plant or buying up land along the riverine system and rehabilitating it. And they'd worked out the numbers and it showed that if they buy land, protect it, rehabilitate it, they don't have to build as large a treatment plant. And so that they went that way, and that's been one of the sort of major case studies in terms of utilizing nature and ecosystem services to our benefit. So it's because of stuff like that, there's this push for putting our natural systems into our economic and capital frameworks. And if we think about the CVRD, in terms of the numerous benefits that you get from your ecosystems, some of the services you may not even realize you're getting, such as stormwater management and flood retention. If we started putting a monetary value on that and quantifying them, you wouldn't want to, right? You know, if we take out a whole tract of forest and we lose that floodplain ability, what does that mean downstream in terms of stormwater management? And are we flooding out homes because of that? So to go back to your question, now natural asset capital decision-making frameworks are emerging to help sort of prioritize, you know, these important land masses.
Okay, thanks. Well, maybe I'll jump in with a question because we've still got a couple of minutes left. I was saying to Ben during the break that I found the RDN assessment tool they had for determining the priority of climate actions. It was something like 10 different criteria. They were rated at low, medium, and high. It's created a really concise way of prioritizing. And you said that initially, I think we had 124 actions, and you took it then down to 64, and then down to 12, I believe. And you said that criticality and impact, which are obviously crucial, were the guides for sort of prioritizing them. Did you go with just those two elements for criticality and impact, or did you go with, you know, financial cost or equity or other variables?
No, it was just the criticality and impact. It was a high level, just prioritization analysis. We wanted to know, like I said earlier, we wanted to know which actions need to come first, like right away. You know, advocacy and communication, well, that can come after, but you know, we've got to get, you know, we wanted to come up with the list of top actions where, like, what do we need to do now? Because that's always the question, right? We have limited resources, limited time. What's the most priority? What's going to have the biggest bang for the buck? Biggest bang for the buck. So, I mean, it's a simple method to do that. I mean, Ben's is more of a sort of what we call a balanced balanced scorecard approach, or triple bottom line. And you know, both exercises are extremely valuable. We just did ours in more of a easier format, so that it was just faster, and we wouldn't have people pick it apart in the sense of, well, why did you choose, you know, this for equity and this for economics and this for social well-being?
Well, thanks for the clarity on that. And I mean, I agree, those are just the two giant pieces, criticality and impact. I'm just curious for staff with the next sort of iteration, is it those two priority criteria which are being used to prioritize actions, or is it a sort of a broader kind of palette of? Sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Going off of what Dan was talking about in terms of our next steps, I think like going to EMT and getting an understanding of what can actually be accomplished with the resources, staffing, looking at what can be realistically accomplished. I think that's going to help us further refine the list of actions. But yeah, just understanding what needs to be done first. And I think that that's why today we brought forward those cross-cutting actions, because those are first and foremost. And then there is a really extensive list kind of based in these sectoral action groups that will then need to follow. But in order for us to get moving on those, we need to have these sort of organizational structural changes that come first to support that work. So that's what we need to tackle first, and then we can identify which ones can be taken after that.
Great, that's really helpful to know that this sort of the wider range of criteria get applied further on in the process. I see Allison, you got your light on. If you want to answer.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing on the Chief Resilience Officer. So that came along because Rockefeller Foundation decided to launch the 100 Resilient Cities project, and they invited the 100 biggest cities basically. And so in Canada we had Elliot Capel in Toronto and Katie McPherson in Vancouver. Those chief resilience officers do not exist in those two cities, nor do they exist in any of the other ones for the most part anymore, because that funding dried up. And the idea with those projects was, to have that networked peer network to go at things that you could scale up and scale out across this large base. And it was insistent for that funding to be received by a city that chief resilience officer had to be sitting in executive management and worked as much internally as they did externally with partners. By all accounts, they were really effective. And I think what that showed for me, and also, from my earlier days at the City of Victoria, when we established a sustainability department and then summarily had it dissolved and no longer had a director, with me shoved into engineering and public works as a sole one person with zero authoritative power and no budget, is the need for durability. Like, any of these things are great, but if they continue to be blips and then we end up having things recoil, it just undoes everything. And so like the commitments need to be real and have real stamina. Yeah, it would be just my leaving point on that.
Please go ahead. Yeah.
Just in addition to that, having worked in senior management for a decade and a half and being a director of sustainability and a chief, whatever, sustainability officer, you do need that persistence because otherwise, other things come up. But instead of, and you get pulled off, having looked after many other functions, they can sometimes overwhelm you. But what I did for this CATAC report, the first one, so we're just completing our first 3-year report. And Director Giesebrecht was on that first one, and he's helped us with the second one. Is now a 5-year plan, moving to a 5-year plan, and it will go to the next board meeting for final ratification. We did an initial approval of it in July. I only allow 3 to 5 priorities. That's it. Can't do more than that. That's all. And that long, lengthy spreadsheet Director Giesebrecht summarized helped us to do that because it did all of that assessment. And I said, I'll make a joke. It said if it's a really long list, then it's a wish list, and I'm not Santa. It just said that. So it said, so if you can realize, if you gave me 25 things or 50 or 100 or whatever it is that comes up and everyone's happy because everything's on the list, everyone's happy. I then have to go back and argue internally for a year and a half about which ones are mine or better, and 3 departments and Allison's and other, we'll all come up with different ideas. And then we come to the board and say, you haven't figured it out. You haven't made us one recommendation. And then you all have your own opinions and you wonder why nothing gets done. And that's why I said 3 to 5. And I respect the process going through there. I said that it's the organization I work with. I got those 3 done in the budget within 6 weeks. We're now finishing the first round, and we have 5 going into the second 5-year term. And it's actually, one of them's just divided out from 1 to 2. And the new one, of course, is wildfire resilience. So we have essentially water resilience and natural asset management buildings, new and existing, wildfire resilience, and me working, as we've already said, on the internal policy and bylaws with a climate lens. That's it. Thanks.
All right, and on that note of prior politics is about choosing and having priorities rather than wish lists. That's anyway, it's a very clear way of putting it, but we're at 4:00. We're just a little bit after 4. And Mace, we're so close to time. But Robin, was there anything else you wanted to say? So I'm just going to say, just want to ask all of us to thank Robin and Monica for putting all this together, and the speakers who made time today to share some thoughts with us, and all of you for being here. So just a round of applause. Oh. All right, meeting adjourned. Thanks so much.